Hi, and welcome to Learning 3D Character Animation with Jeff Liu. I'm Jeff Liu, and let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a self-taught animator, and I've been working in the CG industry since 1997. Before that, it took me about 1 to 2 years of full-time studying and practicing on my own before I got my first full-time job doing 3D animation. Hopefully this DVD will help you get to that level much faster than I did. I fell in love with 3D character animation the moment I started doing it. I couldn't believe the power and flexibility of CG. You can create something out of nothing. You can turn your ideas into something others can watch and enjoy. So what does it mean to be an animator in the CG industry? Well, you must never stop being a student. You can never stop learning. This industry and technology moves so fast that if you don't keep up, you'll be left behind. The ones who persevere and keep working at their craft will be successful. 3D character animation is twofold. On one side, you have the artistic ability. On the other side, you have technical proficiency. This DVD focuses on the practices and principles in creating good character animation. You will develop faster and be more disciplined in your craft if you have an understanding of how things work and the reasons behind each principle. It's a long road, but I hope this DVD will somehow inspire you and support your quest in becoming a character animator. Before we start talking about animation, let's talk about the world space. The world space is the virtual world in which your 3D characters would exist. It has 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the x-axis. If you're looking directly at your screen, x runs from 0 to positive infinity or 0 to negative infinity going across your screen. And depending on your units, could be centimeters, inches, feet, or whatever, wherever you are on this axis would give you a value of like positive 15 inches or negative 35 feet. But you can never leave that one dimension. Let's bring in a second dimension. Now the y-axis goes straight up or straight down. Positive going up, negative going down. And combining x and y, it'll give you this plane. So if you go 5 units in x and maybe 10 units up in y, you're going to be over here. It's going to be that coordinate. But you can never leave this plane. That's where the z-axis comes in. Z is the depth. If x is going across, y is going up and down, z is going to go straight towards you and straight behind me. Positive towards you, negative behind me. Now instead of a plane, it creates a volume now. So instead of this plane, you could be over here or you could be back here. You could be in any one point in this world now, but that will give you a value of x, y, and z. Okay, that's how the 3D software keeps track of where your object is at any one point in time. It's very important to know this coordinate system because computer animation is very mathematical based. Now fortunately, we don't need to know the math behind the animation. The computer does that for you. But it's very important for us to know which way is positive y, which way is negative z, or positive x, because the tools you'll be using later on would depend on the fact that you know which direction is which. Computer animation differs from traditional animation and claymation in terms of world space. Because in traditional animation, you draw your figure on a piece of paper. And that's a very relative world space. In claymation, you animate the figure in front of you on the table or the stage, and that's a very relative world space also. In computer animation, your world space is infinite, going from the center of your world at 0, 0, 0 to any infinite direction. So say at 1 second, your object could be in this point in time, and 5 seconds later, your object could be over here. So going a course of 5 seconds, your computer will interpolate for you going from this coordinate to this coordinate. And that's a very simple animation. But as your animations get more complex, you'll realize the importance of knowing what the world space is. Picture this. There's a person standing in the center of the world space at 0, 0, 0 for x, y, and z. And in the palm of his hand is a little bug. Now, to this bug, this hand is the entire world. The bug knows nothing outside of this hand. So to him, he's in the center of his own world at 0, 0, 0. Now, say the person takes 10 steps forward and then 10 steps to the right. Now, his position is 10, 0, 10. What is the position of this bug? Well, he still thinks that he's in the center of his own world. So he thinks he's at 0, 0, 0, and that's his local position, dealing with this local world. His global position is going to be the same as the person, pretty much 10, 0, 10. And that's the difference between local position relative to this local world and global position, which is relative to the entire world space. This happens when two or more objects are in the same hierarchy. We call one object the parent and the other the child. Now, it's not taken in a literal sense where this person gave birth to this bug, but it's more of a way for us to define the status level of these 3D objects. A child is any object that is below another object in the same hierarchy. A child's motion will always be affected by the parent's motion. A parent's motion will never be affected by the child's motion. Try to think of it in terms of something like a kangaroo, where the parent is carrying around a child in its pouch. So wherever this parent went, this child had to go. But the child was freely able to move about inside this pouch, and it didn't care where the mom went, and it was pretty much oblivious to where the mom's going. But wherever he moved inside the pouch would be his position, would be the position in which he thinks that he is in. Now, a hierarchy could be more than two objects. It could be 3, it could be 10, or it could be 2 billion objects. And each child doesn't have to have another child. Each child can have a sister-like person, which is in the same level as this other child, this sibling. Say we have one parent. It can have 2 children that are in the same level in the hierarchy. So if you move one child, the other child's not going to move, unless you put this third child underneath the second child. Now, the third child becomes the child of the second. So now the second becomes the parent of this third. Let's describe it in terms of color-coded balls for easier understanding. Say we have a green ball, a blue ball, and a yellow ball. We put the blue ball underneath the green ball. So now the blue ball is a child of this green ball. And now we put the yellow ball underneath the blue ball. So now the yellow ball is the child of this blue ball. If we move the green ball, both the blue ball and the yellow ball move along with it. If we move the blue ball, only the yellow one moves, and the green ball is not affected, because the blue ball is one lower in the hierarchy than the green ball. If we move the yellow ball, nothing else moves with it, because the yellow ball has no child, and the blue ball and the green ball are both parents of this yellow ball. So let's rearrange this hierarchy. Let's take the yellow ball out of the blue ball and place the yellow ball underneath the green ball. So what do we have now? We have the blue ball and the yellow ball being in the same level in the hierarchy. If we move the green ball, again, both the blue ball and the yellow ball move. But if we move the blue ball now, only the blue ball moves because it has no child. And if we move the yellow ball, only the yellow ball moves because it has no child. And the blue ball and yellow ball pretty much are independent now. They're both children of this green ball, but they have nothing to do with each other. Now, there's a name for this green ball. The green ball, no matter what configuration we do, as long as the green ball is the top parent, if it's the top object or top node, it's called the root. So wherever we translate this root, everything else has to go. And this green ball will always be the root unless we put this underneath another object. Then that object becomes the root. So a root has no parent. Anything in 3D can pretty much have this parent-child relationship. You can have 2 empty null sets or 2 locators be parent or child, or you can have 2 models be a parent and child, or you can mix it up. You can have a bone being the parent and a model as a child, or vice versa, or however you want. Now, in terms of character animation, we're going to talk in terms of bones. So let's take an arm, for example. We're going to divide it up into 3 bones. We're going to divide it into the upper arm, the lower arm, and the hand. If we move this hand and we don't move this lower arm and upper arm, there's nothing that's going to happen to this lower arm or upper arm, because this hand is the lowest node in the hierarchy. It's the lowest child. It has no effect for this part or this part, because these are both parents of this hand. Now, if we animate the lower arm, it's going to have an effect on this hand because this hand is a child of this lower arm. So wherever this arm moves, this hand has to go with it. And it's going to have its own independent little twiddling animation around. Again, the upper arm is not affected because it's the parent of these children. Now, if we move the upper arm around, it's going to affect everything down below it. It's going to affect the lower arm, it's going to affect the hand. And in our case, in this three-joint object, this upper arm is the root. Wherever we translate it, whatever we do to it, it will affect also all the children underneath it. If we now look at the entire body, it's usually the hip joint that is the root for the entire character. So that means when you want to translate the entire character around, you usually grab the hip joint. And all bones are in some way connected to those hips. Going up from the hips is the spine, then splitting off to the two arms and going up the neck and the head. And also going down from the hips are the two legs. If you look at the two legs in a hierarchy, they should be in the same level in a hierarchy. And if you look at the two arms, they should be in the same level in a hierarchy also. So that means that you can animate one arm independently from the other and one leg independently from the other. Since we're talking about the entire skeleton, the next topic is going to be character setup. And we need to do this because without a character, we can't character animate. So bear with me, all right? Character setup is a very in-depth topic, and it deserves its own training video all on its own. But it's very important for a character animator to know character setup, because when you're animating a shot and you find that it's very hard to animate a certain move or a certain thing that this character has to do, sometimes it's easier to adjust the character rig than animating the hard way. Now, before you set up a character, you have to look at what your character looks like, what your character is going to be doing in the animation. Is your character a cartoony character or is he photoreal? It all depends on these questions, what the skeleton will look like inside his body. The method of character setup is different in every software package, but the idea is the same. The basic idea is that you have a 3D model of a character and you insert a skeleton inside to control this 3D mesh. So for example, if I have an arm and I insert some bones in the arm, then I assign some of the polygons or some of the NURBS control points or the spline control points to this bone in the arm. Wherever I move this arm, those points will follow. You would do that for the entire skeleton, so whatever limb you move, those points on the mesh should follow that limb. You can always tell when a certain point in the mesh does not belong to any bone when you drag the entire body around and you see certain points sticking out like spikes. That tells you that these points don't belong to anything and you want to reassign those points to whatever bone they're supposed to belong to. Now, the skeleton shouldn't be anatomically correct. If you're setting up a skeleton for a humanoid character, there's no way it should be anatomically correct in terms of the amount of bones because there's just so many bones in the body. We want to keep things simple because in animation, if we have fewer bones, that's fewer bones to pose. If we have 100 bones to pose, on each keyframe, we're going to have to rotate 100 bones. And that's not too fun. To have a fun animation, the fewer the bones, the faster you can animate. But you should be careful about having too few bones. You should have enough that you can deform your character to look anatomically correct. Now that's the key. You want your character to look anatomically correct, but you don't want the underlying skeleton to be anatomically correct. The things you got to look out for are where the joints are positioned in the body. So you want to be able to rotate your limbs in the correct manner. You don't want to have an elbow joint over here. You want to have it over here. Looking at the spine, there's a lot of vertebrae in the spine, and we don't want every single one in our character. I usually like 3 to 4 bones in a skeletal spine. I believe 4 gives you more than enough. 3 is pretty good also. You just want enough that you can easily bend your character and make him look flexible without creasing your model in any way that it's not built for. If you look at a human spine, if you look at in any textbook, you'll see that the spine is curved, like an S curve. You don't want to set up your bones in that manner. The reason for that is because when you do a twisting action with your bones, if your bone is angled like this, if you have an S-curved spine, rotating it in this axis is going to rotate your chest at an angle, and that's not natural. You want to have a spine that's more straight. So when you rotate your chest, it's going to rotate the way you want it to. It's going to look anatomically correct, but it's not really anatomically correct. Now, talking about some other joints, the biggest problem usually for characters in 3D are the shoulders, because the amount of rotation that you need in your character is very difficult to get in 3D. In a human, it's a ball and socket joint. It's very articulate. You can move this like crazy. You can move it anywhere you want. In 3D, the bones are really pulling the points on that model. So if you have any twisting motion, it's not really the skin sliding over the muscles. It's really the bone directly controlling the skin. It's going to give you pinching. Sometimes, if you can avoid that complex shoulder, the better. If you can design your character with, say, detachable arms, maybe give him armor or some sort of shirt where he can twist any way he wants and you don't really see it. You don't really see the error in that shoulder. Another solution for the shoulder area is to split off joints. This is another case where a character is not anatomically correct. If you look at the arm, usually we have one joint going from here to here and another joint going from here to here. But if you wanted to avoid this pinching problem that you get usually in the shoulders, we can add a joint in the middle. So have a joint going from here to here and then here to here. So this joint will take care of this type of rotation, and then this joint will take care of this rotation and this rotation. And that's one way in 3D how we can avoid known problems. Another case where you might not want to be anatomically correct is when you want to add certain bones to do certain functions. Say you have a character that likes to spin around, that likes to jump up in the air and do somersaults and flips and crazy spins. You might want to add a bone for the center of gravity, for the character to spin around that center of gravity. What we talked about before, having the hips as the root, if you rotate around that root doing a somersault, that doesn't look correct in terms of spinning around the center of gravity, because a character's hips might be pretty low, especially if your character has short legs. If you're going to rotate around his hips, it's going to look lopsided. So if we have another bone for the center of gravity, that character can spin and rotate around this center of gravity bone, and placing that pretty much where the center of gravity is for that character, and it can have natural spins and twists and whatever. Now that means the hips are no longer the root for that character. This center of gravity bone is. And that's very tricky. The more bones you add, the more you have to worry about. Now the key for a character setup is to keep your character setup simple. So when you're animating your character, it's going to be easy, it's going to be fun, and you're not going to get too burnt out from animating, because the more bones you have, the more things you got to keep track of, and the less fun it gets. It becomes pretty tedious. But keeping a character simple doesn't mean to have as few bones as possible. You can have a very complex setup, but you can also have very few controls to animate that character. One case of a complex setup making your life a lot easier might be in the hand. If you look at the hand, there's just so many joints you have to worry about, and animating each joint in each finger is going to be very tedious. So if you know in your animation that you just want the hand to be open and closed in a fist, you can make a slider. So for example, the slider at 0 could be a closed fist. If the slider slides to 100, it'll open up the hand. Slide back to 0, it'll be closed. Now this is another case of making your life a lot simpler with a very complex setup. Actually, setup's not that complex. This is something you'll learn later on when we get more into detail about the animation principles. If you've already been animating, you're probably running into a problem where your feet go through the floor or your hands penetrate through something you want to hold on to, like a table or a cup or something like that. There's a feature in most software packages. Almost any character animation package should have a feature called inverse kinematics. Now, what we've been talking about before is called forward kinematics, where, say you rotate the shoulder, then you rotate the elbow, then you rotate the hand. Now, that's in a very forward direction, going from the top of the hierarchy down to the bottom of the hierarchy. In inverse kinematics, we can grab the hand and move it anywhere we want, and it's going to solve for this elbow and this upper arm to be in the position so that this hand is where we want it to be. So we could pull this over here, and these joints are going to solve. We could pull it down here, and these joints are going to solve. Now, there are many functions of inverse kinematics, but the main function is to keep limbs from penetrating or going through objects that you don't want them to go through. So the feet will stick to the floor, your hands will stick to the steering wheel, and so on. Another advantage of IK over forward K is that you have only one point to animate. You have this target, so you can translate this anywhere you want, and all these joints will be positioned to that target. In forward K, you have all these joints you need to animate now. That might be like 3 more things you have to animate over this one target. One disadvantage about IK is that if you happen to pull the target out too far for the limbs to reach, those limbs will snap pretty quickly, and that'll give you unnatural motion also. So you have to be aware of how far you pull your IK target, because the bones will not stretch. So be wary of how far you pull your IK chain so your limb doesn't overextend so quickly. Now, the greatest problem in inverse kinematics is you lose the natural look of the limb. So in forward kinematics, when we rotate, we get a natural arc. So if I rotate my shoulder and elbow, I get a natural looking arc, like I'm picking up something. With inverse kinematics, since everything is controlled by this end of the hierarchy, when we translate, we're no longer getting arcing type motions. We're getting linear type motions. If I translate my hand from here to here, it's going to be linear looking, and that's very robotic. It's not very organic looking. So that's the trade-off between forward kinematics and inverse kinematics. Now, you have to pick and choose what you want to best fit your shot. If you're going to be grabbing a lot of things, like if your character is going to be picking up lots of things or running all over the place, definitely use inverse kinematics. If your character is going to be flipping in the air, doing crazy spinning kicks, or just not touching anything with his hands, forward kinematics might be the better way to go. So probably the best setup would be a hybrid type setup where you can switch from IK to forward K pretty easily. Because in most cases, your character is going to be doing more than just walking and more than just flying in the air. He's going to be doing both. And you want to be able to switch from IK to forward K easily. Sometimes it's just a switch turning on IK when you need it and turning it off when you don't need it. Sometimes it's another slider type deal where you can smoothly blend from IK to forward K. And that's often the best because switching on and off IK, you usually see a popping motion. Say my foot is on the ground or my hand is on a table and I switch to IK once I get to that table. You're going to notice a simple little jitter, little glitch there if you're not careful about posing your forward K and IK at the same position. So using a slider type deal to blend from IK to forward K over a large number of frames, you'll get a less noticeable type of switch. The important thing is that you know the difference between IK and forward K and when to use them. For example, I usually like using forward K in the arms because I like to get that free-flowing rotational look to them. And I like using IK on the feet simply because it's easier to keep the feet from going through the floor. Another very important feature in character animation is the constraint system. Now, not all character animation software has constraints, but if your software does have constraints, that's a very good thing. Now, don't confuse constraints with rotation limits. For example, a limit would be where one joint can't move further than a certain rotation. Like my elbow cannot bend further than this. That's a limit. A constraint is a way to force one object to do what you want it to do at all times, no matter what. Some of the important constraints are things like the translation constraint or point constraint. Now, this constraint forces one object to be translated to the position of another object. For example, if I translate this blue ball to the green ball, wherever I move this green ball, this blue ball has to go. Now, this doesn't mean however I rotate this green ball, this blue ball will rotate. That's not the case. This is only translation. So if I rotate this green ball, nothing happens to this blue ball. Now, where would you use this translation constraint? Say you have a character who needs to jump in a car and drive around and then jump out of a car. Well, in the old days, before constraints, we would have 3 different models for this. We would have the character, the car, and a model of the character in the car. So you would do this by animating the character to hop in the car, then turn off the character and turn off the car, and then turn on the model of the character already in the car. And when you move them around, it's just one model, so of course it looks like the character's in the car. Now, there's nothing really wrong with this, but it's an old way of doing things, and especially nowadays, it's going to affect things like special effects that you add to your character or motion blur for that scene, because on that instant, there's not going to be any motion blur. It also makes your scene bigger, and it's harder to organize that way. So with the translation constraint, you can constrain your character to the car and then just move the car around, and the character will move with the car. When you want the character to get out of the car, just lower the enforcement of the translation constraint down to 0. And now your character and car can move freely by themselves. Pretty much in conjunction with the translation constraint, there is an orientation constraint or a rotation constraint. Now what that does is, say I have a blue cone and a green cone. If I orient constraint this blue cone to this green cone, it doesn't move anywhere. It doesn't translate anywhere. But if I rotate this green cone, this blue cone will rotate just like it. Now, where would you use this? Well, for characters, most of them have 2 eyeballs. And in the theme of keeping things simple, say you just want to animate 1 eyeball. So you can orient constraint the other eyeball to this 1 eyeball that you're rotating, and that's one thing to animate now, just that 1 eyeball. You don't have to animate 2 eyeballs anymore. And you can be sure that wherever this eyeball is looking, the other one's going to be rotating just like it. You can also use these 2 constraints when picking up objects. Say you have a character such as a bean who's going to pick up a gun. Now you would need to use 2 constraints. You would need to use a translation constraint to translate this gun to that bean's hand. And then you would need to orient constraint to orient that gun to follow the rotation of the hand. So the gun looks totally like it's in this bean's hand. The third important constraint is the aim constraint, and it pretty much does what it says. It forces one object to aim at something else at all times. So say I have a blue cone that's aim constraint to a green cone. Now you're going to see that this blue cone is going to point to this green cone no matter where I move this green cone. Now where would you use this aim constraint? Well, in character animation, let's go back to the eyeball animation we were doing, where the right eye was orient constraint to the left eye. Now say we had a scene where a character needed to look at certain objects on the table, and we wanted to make sure that he was really looking at these objects. Well, instead of guessing where these eyes are going to be looking by just rotating and estimating, we can tell it exactly where it should look by aim constraining the eye to a certain null or locator. So wherever we translate this locator, the eyes are looking exactly at that spot. Now there's other constraints like scale constraints or surface constraints or tangent constraints, things like that. They're not very widely used. Well, for example, surface constraints might be used for keeping objects on the surface of a model, maybe a teardrop or a sweat rolling down someone's cheek. Now the constraints I talked about earlier are very important in character setup because they can make your character setups very complex yet much easier to animate. For example, in IK, where it's kind of difficult sometimes to adjust the position of the elbow. Maybe it's erratic, it's random sometimes. So if you aim constraint your arm to point at a certain object, then it's easy to aim where this elbow is going to be at. And the same goes for the knees, to aim where the knee is supposed to point at all times. Also, going back to that walking animation with the head, maybe you can aim constraint the chest. So the head can look somewhere and the chest can move about wherever it wants. This is a sort of isolation type setup where different parts of the body are isolated from the other parts. So you don't have to really do everything in forward kinematics where the chest would affect the head. If you rotate the chest, the head has to rotate. This is no longer the case. You can aim the head and rotate the chest anywhere you want. And that makes life easier sometimes. Sometimes it makes it harder. It's up to you to experience these different tools so you know which ones to use on which animations. Another key thing about constraints is that it turns your rotational data into translational data. Let's go back to that eye animation. Instead of rotating the eyes, you're now translating this locator for where the eyes should be looking. It's much easier to look at translational data than rotational data because translational data deals with the axes we're used to, like the X, Y, and Z. Rotational data is somewhat more difficult because it's a combination of X, Y, or Z rotations. Now this is something we'll go into next using the graph editor. Now we're going to talk about the graph editor, which is sometimes called the curve editor. Now what the graph editor does is that it gives you a graphical representation of your motion curve by plotting out the data points. Now the graph editor is one of the most important tools in character animation, so pay very careful attention because you will live in the graph editor. Looking at the graph editor, it looks like any old type of graph. Going across the horizontal axis is the time value. Now, time could be measured in time code or frames. Animators usually like frames better because it's much easier to read. Time code is pretty difficult to read in terms of animation. Going up and down the vertical axis is the value of your selected object. Now, the value could be in terms of translation, rotation, scale, percentage of the constraint, or whether it's on or off. Any attribute that you select that is animatable. Now the easiest thing to look at first is the Y translation, because looking at the curve that it plots is pretty much what your object is doing. Let's take a ball for example, and let's keyframe this ball at a height of 0 for frame 0. And at frame 10, let's move this ball up to 20 units and keyframe it there. At frame 20, let's move this ball back down to 0 and keyframe it there. If we look at our graph editor, we can see the curve that our motion is giving us, and it pretty much looks like a parabola. If we go back to our animation and at frame 30 we can keyframe this ball at -20, and in frame 40 we can keyframe this ball at 0 again. And if we go back to our graph editor, we can see what the curve looks like now. Now if you look at the curve itself, you can see that it's very smooth at the apexes of its curve. Now why is that? It's because by default your software should choose a spline interpolation for your animation. Now there's many different types of interpolation. We can have a spline interpolation, which we have right now. We can have a linear interpolation, or we can have a step interpolation. They will all give you different types of motion. Now if we look at our animation with this spline interpolation, we could see that it gives us very natural looking motion, where this ball goes up and when it reaches frame 10 it slows down and starts going down, and then when it reaches frame 30 it slows down and then starts going back up until frame 40. Now this is very natural looking motion. It gives us acceleration and deceleration. If we switch our curve to be linear, then watch the difference. Our ball would go up at a constant rate and then it'll look like it'll hit some hard ceiling, then go down at a constant rate and look like it's going to hit a hard floor. Now this motion is very linear and very constant. There's no acceleration, there's no deceleration. It's very mechanical. If we switch our curve to be step, watch what happens. Our ball stays put for about 10 frames, then pops up to the keyframe for about 10 frames, then jumps back down for another 10 frames. There's no interpolation. It's pretty much on or off. Let's try a different type of animation. Let's delete this animation and let's keyframe our ball at frame 0 at height 0. And let's go to frame 10 and keyframe our ball at 10 units up. And let's go to frame 20 and then keyframe our ball 10 more units up. If we play this animation, we can see that this ball will rise constantly from 0 to 20. And in our graph editor, it'll show us a straight line giving us constant velocity. Now, there's another important feature in the graph editor where you can control the tangents of a curve. So let's look back in the graph editor and select the keyframe at frame 10, and we can see some handles pop up. Now these handles are the tangent handles. If we pull at these handles, we can see that we can adjust the curve. We can adjust the curve to whatever we want. First, there's an option for letting us flatten out this tangent. So if we click that option, our tangent will be flat. Now if we go back to our animation and play our animation through, we can see that our ball will decelerate by the time it gets to frame 10, pause there for a certain bit, and then accelerate back up and go onwards to frame 20. By flattening out a tangent, that's a good way to show ease out and ease in, and that's another principle of animation that we'll talk about later. We also have the ability to stretch out this tangent to as far as we want or as little as we want. So let's say we stretch it out even farther. So what's the effect? Now by looking at this curve, let's try to figure out what's going to happen to this ball before we look at the animation. If we look at the slope of this curve in the beginning, it's pretty steep. It's much steeper than before. So it's going to change its value from 0 to 10 much quicker in a less amount of frames. So the ball is going to shoot up much faster. And if we see the keyframe at frame 10, the value does not change for a longer period of time. So that ball is going to sit there for a little bit longer. And continuing more, we see that the slope of the curve is steep again for a shorter amount of time. So that ball is going to shoot up much quicker. And looking back at our animation and playing it through, that's exactly what happens. If we go back to the graph editor and look at the keyframe at frame 10, let's do another function of the graph editor. Let's break the tangent. We can now click this button and break the tangent. So what that means is we can pull each handle of the tangent independently of the other, and we can create our own type of motion curve. And as you can see, if we break our tangent and make it into a shape of a V, it's going to give us a very interesting curve. Now let's see what it does to our animation. So what you're looking at is the motion that we're getting from this animation curve. An interesting thing about spline curves is that they have a natural tendency to be curved. They want to be curved. That's what they're built to do. So let's show an example here of a ball keyframed at frame 0 to be a height of 0. And let's keyframe it at frame 10 to be at a height of 0. And keyframe it at frame 20 to be a height of 10. Now in our minds, we want this ball to remain at 0 from frame 0 to 10. And we want it to go up from 10 to 20. And as you can see in the graph editor, there's going to be a nice looking curve going from 0 to 10 and then 10 to 20. Now this is not what we want, but this is what's going to happen when you use a spline interpolation. And if we go back to our animation and play this animation, you can see that this ball is going to drop below 0 and then rise up. And that's not what we want. We want this ball to stay put on 0. So if we go to our graph editor, the way to fix that is to select those keys at frame 0 and frame 10 and flatten out the tangents. That'll give us a constant animation. That'll give us a constant flat curve going from 0 to 10. And then from 10 to 20, we're going to get a nice acceleration going up. Now that's the drawback of using spline interpolation, but that is very important to get very organic looking motion in 3D animation. Most character animation softwares will use spline interpolation by default. So you will get natural looking organic motion that is very arcing and that curves on you. You just have to be wary of times when you don't want it to be curved. Like for example, if you place a foot target on the ground, just like the example we used on the ball, we don't want that foot to go through the ground now because the spline curve will want to dip down and come back up. So when using spline interpolation, as you should use it. Just be careful. Just keep in mind that you might have to flatten out tangents when you want them to be constant. So as you can see, using the Y translation is a very easy way to see what the graph editor can do. Now let's see what it does for X and Z. Pretty much for the X and Z translation, it does the same thing, but it goes along their axis. It goes along the X axis and it goes along the Z axis. We can think of it as a Y axis that's flipped on its side. So for X, an increase in value would be going in the positive X direction. A decrease in value would be going in the negative X direction. And the same thing for Z. Once you know the directions of the axes that you're working in, it's pretty easy. But one thing to keep in mind is that all of these axes are independent. So your Y curve has no effect on your X motion. And your X curve has no effect on your Z motion, and etc. So you can tug and pull on these keyframes all you want, and you can be sure that it won't affect the other axis. But what it will do is disorganize your animation. So be sure not to tug and pull in the horizontal direction too much, because that will readjust your key to a different point in time. You can do it up and downwards as much as you want, and that keeps your animation still pretty organized. Just be careful not to shift it off sideways too much, because it'll look like you have more keys than you really do. Now that we've looked at translation, let's look at scale. Let's hold off on rotation because that's a little more difficult. Scale is pretty easy. Instead of going up the units of translation, we're now going a percentage of scale. So we can go from 0 to 100 or 0 to 1,000 or whatever you want. It goes to infinite pretty much. So just like in translation, scaling in any one axis is independent to the other two axes. So scaling in Y has no effect in X or Z. I guess you're wondering what the importance is of scaling. Well, there's many different uses of scaling in animation. You can show squash and stretch, which is a very important principle in character animation. You can show expansion of like a balloon, or you can shrink an object very quickly to make it disappear. I use scaling a lot in Killer Bean Gunfire, where I would scale an object to 100 and then scale it back down to 0 2 frames later. It's much like turning a model on and off, but for example, in slow motion, you would want to see that gunfire grow in slow motion and then shrink in slow motion. And you wouldn't want to see it switch on and off in slow motion because it'll be too fast. Now let's talk about looking at rotational data in the graph editor. This is a whole different ballgame from looking at translational data or scaling data in the graph editor, because unlike translational and scaling, where the X, Y, and Z axes are independent of each other, in rotational data, the X, Y, and Z axes can all have a different part in orienting your object. So you can never really isolate the X, Y, and Z axes independently, at least not in the Euler coordinate system. Now, there's three types of different rotational coordinate systems. We have the Euler coordinate system, which is the default system. It's basically X, Y, and Z, different rotations. You can rotate around the X-axis, Y-axis, or Z-axis. Now, when I say rotate around, if we have the X-axis going across, you're going to be rotating around the axis, kind of like an axle, like an axle in a car, where the tire is rotating around this axle. So if we have Y, you're going to be rotating around this way, and Z, you're going to be rotating around this way. And the Euler coordinate system has X, Y, and Z. There's another system called the vector system. Now, the vector system adds another axis. Not many 3D software has this vector system, but Animation Master has it. And the fourth axis is the roll axis, where you would have a bone, and you could rotate it in X, Y, or Z, but then going down the bone, no matter which way the bone's oriented, you're going to have a perpendicular handle coming up, which is the roll handle. It's basically the twist of that bone. I like using vector a lot because it gives you extra control. Let's talk about the third rotational coordinate system, which is the quaternion system. It's pretty much the most advanced system, but I don't really use it that much because it's not really clear-cut how to read it in the graph editor. And the reason because is it introduces the W axis. So you have an X, Y, and Z axis plus the W axis. And the thing about the quaternion coordinates is it often prevents rotational flipping that you get from Euler rotations. Now, why is looking at rotational data difficult in the graph editor? Well, if you don't believe me, let's check one out. As you can see, this graph editor looks like a mess. This looks like spaghetti. There's all these curves going around. Now, unlike translational and scaling data, it's not really obvious to the person what the rotations are doing. Now, if we look at this section where the curves are crisscrossing and going all over the place, there's not really a way to figure out what this rotation is going to look like in your head. Now, instead of trying to really figure out what the rotation is going to look like, it's best to really look at rotational curves in the most basic form, looking at it as a curve itself. So if we remember what translational curves were doing, if the slope is pretty steep, going up sharply or going down sharply, that means the rotation is going to happen very quickly. It's going to be a very snapping motion. And if that slope is pretty shallow, going down, or gradually going up, that means that rotation is going to happen slowly over a large amount of time. And if that curve is pretty flat, there's no slope or incline to it at all, that means that rotation is going to be held pretty constantly. So there's not going to be any animation going on there. Now, that's really the only way you can look at a rotational curve, just looking at where it accelerates, where it decelerates, smoothing out little kinks from it, making sure the rotations are nice and smooth. One of the biggest problems in 3D animation is that you get a thing called gimbal lock. And gimbal lock happens when two rotational axes crisscross, and rotating in X and rotating in Z do the same thing. You're wondering, what? I don't get why they would crisscross. Well, if you've ever tried 3D animation and you tried rotating something in your animation, and you rotate it to a certain angle, like so, and then in another position you rotate it thinking that the way you rotated it is pretty much how it's going to look when it's animated. But when you go back and play your animation, it's rotating totally differently than what you expected. And this is because the way and order in which you rotate an object is not the same way and order the 3D software would rotate that object. In computer animation, in order to really rotate an object in a repeatable way, the 3D software uses what's called rotation order. Every software has a rotational order, but some of them won't let you change them. Now, what exactly is rotation order? Well, rotation orders mostly deal with the Euler coordinate system, where you have an X, Y, and Z axes, where you can rotate around those 3 axes. And the computer needs a way to rotate an object consistently, and the same way for every object. So it has to choose which way should I rotate it. You might rotate an object, say you rotate it in Z and you like that position, and then you kind of roll it over this way, and then you rotate it this way, and you're like, that's a good rotation. That's what I want. Well, the computer doesn't keep track of all your little steps that you did to get to that rotation. It's going to rotate it the way it wants to, which is X, Y, or Z. It rotates in the X-axis first. Gets to that position where it's like, okay, matches yours in X, but I got to match it in the other 2 now. So it'll rotate in Y next, and it'll rotate in Z finally. Some software will let you change the rotational order. I recommend don't do this because it'll only confuse you much more. Stick to the default X, Y, and Z because rotations are hard enough to understand. Now let's describe what exactly happens in rotation orders and why gimbal lock happens. If we rotate X first, which is our first order of rotation, everything's fine. You know, you can rotate X independent of Y and Z because it's the first order of rotation. That's the first rotation that the computer is going to rotate. So if you don't touch Y and Z, you're totally fine. You can treat it like this is an independent rotation. Now if we add the Y rotation, you might not see this in your software. Some software will hide the fact that it has rotation orders, that the X and Z axes will crisscross. But picture this. If you rotate Y, since Y is the second degree of rotation, it's going to carry X along with it. So when you rotate in the Y-axis, the computer has to retain the X rotation. And the only way to do that is to make sure the X rotation doesn't change or move in relation to the Y rotation. So it will move with the Y rotation. But look at what happens when you rotate on the Y-axis too far. And watch the red circle crisscross with the blue circle. That's the X rotational axis crisscrossing with the Z rotational axis. Now if you rotate X or if you rotate Z, they both do the same thing. They both rotate your object in the same manner. This is where rotations get crazy. This is a problem, what we call a gimbal lock. And this is a big problem because if you were isolating X before, and if you goof up and rotate Z, now it's in 2 different axes. Now if you look at the graph editor, you're going to have an X curve and a Z curve doing the same thing, and that's going to give you wacky, wacky rotations. So if we do the Z, we can see that the Y-axis and the X-axis will rotate with the Z-axis because it's the last order of rotation. Order of rotation is something you don't really want to deal with, but it's good to understand because when you get flipping problems in your objects, when your objects don't rotate the way you want them to in between your keyframes, that's why it happens. Now when you see your rotation tool come up, you might not be seeing these different axes kind of crisscross. This is because you're not looking at the very local tool or very local rotation of that object. You're looking at a kind of global rotation for that entire object, but if you break it down into single individual rotations, you will see the X and Z axes cross. It's going to look like something that you're not very used to. Just be aware that this thing can happen, and this thing will screw you up. Now, how do you fix that problem if you have that problem? Well, like I said earlier, it's much more preferable to look at translational data than rotational data. So if you can, if you set your character up where it's constrained, and remember when I said you can constrain your head to look at a certain object by translating, or you could constrain your eyes to a locator and just translate it to rotate your eyes or your head or whatever else you want to rotate. That's a good way. That's a good start because now you don't have to deal with rotations. You're dealing with translations of this locator or whatever target. Another way to do it is by not using Euler coordinates. Euler will be tricky. You can use the other two, which add another axis. It'll give you further control. However, the other axis, especially in vector coordinates, gives you another thing to animate, another thing to keep track of. Although I like the control. I like having more control than less control and having it whack out on you. Some software also has a filter that filters out this flipping problem, and it's called the Euler filter. Now, little disclaimer here. It's a misconception, especially in the whole industry, how to say Euler, how to say the word Euler. Or some people call it Euler. I call it Euler. I don't know. It looks like a Euler to me. Just pronounce it any way you want. I mean, we're animators. We're not supposed to be smart. Another way of dealing with these crazy rotations, say you do want to isolate rotations. Say you want an Olympic diver to do somersaults in the x-axis rotation, also while doing twisting rotations in y. Now, if you try to do that with a normal setup, if you try to do that with a Euler setup, because of rotation order, you will have problems. If you do want to isolate rotations in a Euler setup, the best way to do that is to have one bone for each rotation. Meaning, if I want to isolate x rotations, I would have a bone that can only rotate in the x-axis and lock off the y and z. Then if I wanted to isolate the y rotations, I would have another bone that can only rotate in y and lock off x and z. Now these isolation bones would then become the root, and your character resides under these bones. I see lots of cases where lots of beginner animators would encounter that kind of Euler flipping problem, but they really wouldn't understand why that's happening or how that's happening. So what they would do is now go in between their two keyframes and animate every single frame in between those two keyframes to force that rotation to do what they want it to do. Now this is a very bad way to animate, because not only does it make your animation less flexible if you need to change it, it's still not going to fix it down to the very minute level. If you go in between two frames with motion blur, in between those two frames, those curves still might flip out. Your motion blur is going to look crazy. Your motion blur might blur out for one frame, because in between two frames your object might flip to an extreme of one rotation, and that's pretty bad. So try to stay away from animating on every frame. We don't want to do that in computer animation. You got to let the computer animate for you. So if you run into a Euler problem where it's flipping or doing something, either filter it out with a Euler filter or figure out some way how to animate or to constrain your rotation so it does what you want it to do. A good way to isolate rotations, again, is using constraints. So you can always isolate a twisting rotation. In Animation Master, it's the aim roll at constraint, where you can control the twisting motion of a bone. Then you don't have to worry about flipping. Unfortunately, that setup has drawbacks also. Say you're working with the director and you have a spin in that twisting diving motion, and you're like, yeah, I think that spin, that's a good spin, is pretty quick. And then you show it to the director. So you animate this locator going around the character just by translating now. Just translating that locator to control the spin, and you're done. Now think about how many keyframes that would take. At least 4 keyframes. One up here, then another keyframe here, it's going to rotate. Another keyframe down here, it's going to rotate. And another keyframe over here is going to rotate. So you get somewhat of a circle. If you want to rotate your guy about 5 times, that's 20 keyframes. So now you show your director, and the director's like, yeah, you know, I think that's cool, but I want him to spin at least, 10 times. So now you're like, okay, how would I do that? I got like 20 keys here. Now that's the problem. That's the problem of using translation instead of rotations. Now for that case, it might be best to do the isolating of rotations using more than one bone. So instead of animating 20 to 30 keyframes, you can set 2 keyframes. Set one at 0, and then if he wants to do like 10 rotations, set another keyframe at 3,600 for 10 rotations of 360 degrees. In the graph editor, you get that really sharp line going from 0 to 3,600. and your guy's going to spin around 10 times. It's important to know different ways of doing things so you can make your life easier if you get changes. If the director wants to change things on you, you got to be able, you got to make sure your shot is flexible enough that you can change things and that the first time you do things isn't the final way. So basically, the graph editor is the tool to see what your motion is doing in a visual representation. There's lots of times when I animate a few key poses where a guy might be shifting his weight just from landing from a strong land, and you might see that his weight shift is not really believable. So you would go in and you could figure out, okay, this curve for this weight shift has to decelerate. So right now it's not. It's kind of looking kind of bumpy. So I want to change these keyframes around to make this curve look like it's decelerating. That's one of the cases where graph editor is so important. You're going to live in a graph editor. You're going to love it. If you don't love it yet, you better love it because it's so powerful. So far we've just been talking about how to animate simple objects or objects with very few bones. Now let's talk about how to animate an entire character. What exactly is a keyframe? A keyframe is the basic building block of animation. However, in computer animation, it's very different to keyframe than in traditional animation or claymation. Unlike the traditional side, where you just set keys and you might have an assistant animator to set the in-between keys for you to draw out the in-betweens or interpolate what you're trying to do. In computer animation, the computer does that for you. Now, that's a good thing, and that's also a bad thing. The good thing is that it takes less people to do a production because the computer is assisting you in making the in-between keys. The bad thing is the computer is making the in-between keys. Now, what do I mean by that? In computer animation, if you set a keyframe in the beginning and in the end, it will definitely affect what's going on in the middle. In traditional animation, what goes on in the beginning and the end does not necessarily affect what's in the middle because they're independent of each other. A keyframe in the middle is pretty much independent from the beginning and the end. In computer animation, that's not the case because it's the computer trying to mathematically interpolate things for you. It's not a person saying, oh yeah, okay, I guess he wants to do this in the middle. No, the computer doesn't think, it just does it. In computer animation, when you set a keyframe for that selected object or a selected attribute, you're telling the computer to remember that pose or value for that current point in time. So the computer saves all that info into a database, and it's going to know how to interpolate between one keyframe at one point in time and another keyframe later in time. Different types of software will have two different basic types of keyframing. There's manual keyframing and there's auto keyframing. Manual keyframing is anytime you set a pose, anytime you rotate something or reposition something, you have to set a key for those attributes that you want to be keyed. Auto keyframing is anytime you rotate something or translate something, the computer will automatically set a key for you. Now, it depends on your preference on what you want to use because a lot of people like to use auto key simply because it's fast. You can skip that step of keyframing things. Some people like manual keying because they like to play around with poses a lot before they set the key. Personally, I like to auto key simply because it's fast, it doesn't distract you, you can animate, you can get into a flow. You don't have to stop every time and hit some key button or manually set a key. Now, going back to manually keying, there's different ways of manually keying your character. There's keying every single attribute that is keyable, which is sometimes crazy because you don't really want to key every single attribute. Sometimes things like visibility or IK enabling or things like that, you don't want to keyframe all the time. There's also a method of keying everything below the selected object. So you can select the shoulder and everything below the shoulder will be keyed all the way down to the fingertips. Or you can select the root and everything below the root will get keyed. Also, you can select an object and just have that object be keyed. So if you select the shoulder, you can just key the shoulder and nothing else below it or above it will be keyed. And the smallest form of manually keyframing is manually keyframing selected attributes. So if I select translate X for my root, I could just key that. Or If I select rotate Y for my leg or knee, that will just be keyed. Usually you'll do that for things like visibility or IK enabling, or for isolating rotations or translations. Now, what are the drawbacks of manually keying? Well, like I said earlier, manually keying, the biggest drawback is the amount of time it takes to manually key. That's another extra step you got to do every time you want to set a key. Now, if you like to manually key, if you set a manual key on the root, and you're going to key every single bone below that root, you have to worry about keying every single joint that you don't want to be keyed, like the fingers or toes or hair. Things that you want to go back and key later, you don't really want to manually key all the time, because then you have to go back and delete those keys eventually, or clean up those keys. Maybe you're saying, well, okay, I'm not going to go and key every single bone every time I make a key pose. I'm going to select the joints I want to be keyed and just key them for those joints. Now, that's also another extra step, selecting each joint that you want to be keyed and manually setting that key. There are pros to manually keying. One thing is it helps you keep track of what's being keyed and what's not, because it forces you on every key pose to really think of what you're keying and what needs to be keyed. When you're auto keying, you're more in the flow of animation, and sometimes you don't realize that you should have keyed some bones and they're not being keyed, and later on you find out that a pose you make later on affects the poses that you made earlier, and you're like, whoa, I guess I should have keyed those. Now, what are some disadvantages of auto keying? Well, I mentioned some earlier where if you're animating and you're in a flow of animation using auto key, sometimes you might neglect some joints that need to be keyed. Also, if you're just rotating joints or translating in one axis using auto key, well, it might just key that one axis and leave the other two unkeyed. If you're using auto key and say you're just translating in X, auto key will not set keys for Y or Z. And you have to be aware of that, because if you set a key for Y or Z later on, that keyframe you did earlier with just X, the Y or Z will definitely be affected by the keyframe later on. Same goes for rotations. If you're having trouble on deciding which method to use, either manually keying or auto keying, it's best to really try it out for yourself. So try an animation with manually keying all the attributes and keyframes yourself, and try an animation using auto key. If you like manually keying, you'll find out that you probably won't use auto key at all. But if you like auto keying, you'll probably find out that maybe 25% of the time you will use manually key, because auto key cannot do everything, and sometimes auto key is slower than manually keying the entire body. I think it's best described in an example, because this might be a little bit confusing. First, let's introduce our character, and he's going to be our humanoid representative. First, let's think of an animation for him. Let's have him start from a squatting position, and then have him stand up and wave hi to everyone. So let's start with him squatting. I'm going to set keys for all the joints that need to be keyed for this squatting position. Basically, all the major joints in his body. We're going to skip the fingers. We're going to skip his hair. He doesn't have hair, so don't worry about that. Basically, I'm going to key his spine. I'm going to key his root, his hips. I'm going to key his legs. I'm going to key his arms and neck and head. So I'm going to position all of those bones into a squatting position, and then I'm ready to move on to my next keyframe. So my next keyframe, he's going to be standing up, and maybe raising his arm a bit in the process of getting it up to wave. So again, I'm going to keyframe all the joints that I need to be keyed. Basically, they are the same keys. The hips, spine, neck, head, arms, legs. No fingers yet. Then we continue the keyframing for all the same joints in a standing position where his arm is up and it's ready to start waving. So we go to the next keyframe, and we're going to rotate it into the position of his arm waving just by rotating his arm. And then go ahead a few more frames and rotate the arm the other direction. Then do the same thing, a couple more keyframes, back and forth, and then we're done. And if we play our animation, we see our character standing up, and his arm is waving. Now let's bring another thing into the mix. Let's say we want him to squat back down after he waves. Well, okay, let's do this to our current animation. So after the last wave, we'll skip ahead a few more frames, and we're going to keyframe him into a squatting position again. And to do that, we would set keys for all the major joints again, the hips and so on, like we did before. Okay, now that we have that, let's scrub through our animation and let's check it out. And as you can see, the position he's in when he's waving is not the position we wanted him to be in. It looks pretty lame right now. It looks like, I don't know what it looks like. So that's the problem. Do you guys know why this happened? It's because we didn't set a key for those major joints while he was waving his arm. We were just setting keys for his arm. So here's an example of where you have to be aware of what he's going to be doing on the next keyframe, so you know on the current keyframe what joints to key. And as you can see, before my squatting pose, I want to be sure that in this standing pose where he stops waving, I want to be sure that all the joints that I want to key in the next pose are keyed in my current pose to hold that pose. Because otherwise, the keyframe on the next pose will affect my pose on this current frame. Okay? So to fix this mess up, well, it's going to be way too hard to just go back in the middle and just try to repose him into a standing position, because we had our standing position. It looked great before. So the easiest thing we could do is go to the keyframe where he's squatting, and what you can do is delete it if you think it's an easy pose to get back to, or you can cut that keyframe out for the entire frame. Now cutting instead of deleting, what that will do is it will save the position or that pose into the clipboard of your computer. Every computer has a clipboard. It has nothing to do with the software. It has everything to do with your operating system. So all of that is shoved into memory in your computer, and you can go to that keyframe where he's last standing and waving and make sure you set all the keys for the major joints again, for the hips, the spine, neck, head, arms, legs. Now that we have that keyframe set, we can go to the frame where we wanted him to squat and just paste that pose back in there. And hopefully it should work with no problems. If you have a problem pasting that pose back in, well, most of the time you're going to have to just delete it and repose him. But this is a much easier way than fighting what this squatting key pose would do to your standing key pose. You might have noticed that our character is rising above the ground a little bit. This is because of our spline interpolation. To fix it, just go in your graph editor and flatten out the curves for his hips. Now he doesn't rise above the ground anymore. This brings up an important note in animation. When you do an animation and you think you're done, but you find out that you have to change something in the middle, it's really hard to change something in the middle while you have keyframes happening later on, because you're going to be fighting those keyframes on every single frame that you change in the middle. One thing you could do is to save off that chunk in the end into another file and delete that chunk from your main file. That way you can work in the middle section as if it is the end. So there are no other keyframes that are going to be fighting your posing in the middle. Another thing you can do, which is quite similar, is to save off your entire animation under a different name and then delete that last chunk and work on your middle section, which is no longer the middle, it's now the end. And then once you're done fixing it, then reload that entire piece and then copy the end chunk onto your current animation. So then it's a full, complete animation again. So to try to avoid changing things in the middle often, you should really play your animations through as you're making them. So everything in the beginning is to your liking before you move onwards. However, sometimes you may not have that luxury. Sometimes you might think your animation is complete and the director might say, oh no, I wanted this to happen in the middle. And then that sucks. Then you have to change it. You have no choice. Now going back to the animation, why didn't I want to keyframe the fingers yet? Well, because I really wasn't sure of what my animation was supposed to look like yet, or what I wanted it to look like for the entire body. So I wanted the entire body to look correct before I animate the fingers. Things like the fingers, the hair, the clothes, the tail, belly jiggles, or whatever, those things should come later. They should come after the major joints are all animated, because those things rely on the major joints. If you have to change the major joints and you animate the fingers already, most of the time you have to redo the fingers anyway. And fingers, like I said earlier, lots of joints, lots of things are key. So let's save them for later, because you never know when your major body animation will change. The director might say, no, I want him to, instead of running over here, I want him to run over here and jump. And if you already have the fingers animated for your previous animation, all that stuff is lost. Just do the amount of work that you need to do, and you should have things signed off as you go. And with that said, it's another reason why you shouldn't really manually keyframe all the joints on every single pose, because that's keyframing those fingers also. I think with practice you'll like auto keying because it lets you be free in your creative expression. You don't have to be bogged down with worrying about hitting that key button all the time. But that doesn't mean you'll never use manually keying. They both have their advantages, so definitely try out both and see which ones you like. Now we're going to talk about the second best tool in character animation, which is called the dope sheet. The dope sheet is like a spreadsheet for keyframes. It'll show you where your keyframes are for your selected object for the range of time that you want. Now let's go back to our hand waving animation and let's look at the keyframes in a dope sheet. As you can see when I get to the wave that I only have keys for the arm and no keys for the legs or the spine or the hips. And that's where I got that error when I brought them back down to a squatting position later on. So the dope sheet is a place where you can see which objects are keyed and where they're keyed, and if you need to key certain objects. Now probably the most important feature of the dope sheet is it allows you to retime your keyframes. So you can select a bunch of keyframes and you can slide them back and forwards. And this is great for making your animations quicker where you need them to be quicker by just sliding your keyframes closer together, or likewise spreading them out to make them slower. Now when using the dope sheet, it is very, very helpful to animate in a very organized manner. I like to animate on 3s and 4s. What that means is I set keys for all my major limbs every 3 frames or every 4 frames. What that does is it keeps my key poses very organized because I know I don't have keyframes in between every 3rd key pose or every 4th key pose. And if I need to retime my animations by stretching out key poses or compressing them, I could do it very easily in a dope sheet and not have to worry about messing up my animation whatsoever. Now I know it might be difficult to keep your key poses organized and looking like this up until the final product. Now this is by no means a rule you have to follow, but this is a method to help you animate more efficiently, because if you animate like this, it's so much easier to retime or to change. Let's go back to the hand waving animation to show an example of retiming. So on the squatting position in the beginning, let's say you want him to stand up much quicker than before. So we would take those key poses in the beginning and just shrink down the keyframes closer together, and let's see what the effect is. As you can see, he's standing up much quicker now. Now let's do the opposite. Let's take these keyframes and spread them apart. Of course, I need to be sure that I retain the same timing I have after he stands up, so that it doesn't change anything else. So I'm going to select the keyframes from the middle of the squat to the end of the animation so that I can be sure that the timing doesn't change for anything after he stands up. It's only going to change from the beginning of the squat to the stand-up position. Now the dope sheet is also useful for deleting big chunks of animation since it is a spreadsheet for keyframes. Now say I want my character to just stand up instead of standing up to wave high. I just want his arm to just remain motionless. So for all those keyframes I set for the arm waving, we could just delete those real quickly and watch what happens. So my character stands up and his arm's not moving. And I know it's not perfect, so we're going to have to go back to readjust anyways, but this is a good way to get rid of animations that you don't want. One thing more about the dope sheet, not only is it a spreadsheet for the keyframes on your joints, it's also a spreadsheet for the keyframes on individual attributes. So you can open up the selected joint in the dope sheet and you can see a list of all the attributes that are keyed and where the keyframes are. Now this is good if you want to check if the X, Y, or Z attributes are all keyed in the same key pose or if they're separated, things like that. I do recommend that all the X, Y, Z attributes are keyed together on that same keyframe. I don't recommend sliding around your X, Y, or Z attributes individually because in the dope sheet, once you close this attribute list, it's going to look like separate keyframes. So let's look at one keyframe where X, Y, and Z are keyed together, and let's shift X, Y, and Z separately. If we close this up again, it'll look like 3 different keyframes, and it's going to confuse you. So The key is be organized so things are easier, and don't shift around these attributes too much. They'll confuse you. Only shift them around when your animation is near final, and by shifting it, it makes it final, because you don't want to do this early on. It's going to confuse you too much, and it's going to make things a lot harder for you. Now, as we get more advanced, we can use the dope sheet to also layer animations. This is something I'm going to talk about later when we get into the art of animation. But keep in mind that we don't have to keep everything efficiently lined up like this. Once we get more into layering, and once we want to show more weight and follow through in animation, the dope sheet is a very easy place to do something like that, just by offsetting keys from these straight lines. If you layer your keyframes to look like this, that's a good way to show follow through and show weight in your character animation. I like the dope sheet. It's very easy to use, and it's very fast. And I hope you use the dope sheet, and I hope you learn how to use it, because without it, animation is not that fun. Trust me, the dope sheet makes things more fun. Now we're going to talk about the methods of posing in animation. There are really only two methods. There's a straight ahead posing method, and there's a pose to pose method. Straight ahead posing, you pretty much start from the beginning and you go every single frame all the way to the end. Meaning you pose the first keyframe, then maybe a frame or two later you continue that pose and pose the next one, and then a frame or two later continue onwards. So you have a flow. You don't really skip ahead. That's what pose to pose is. Pose to pose, you skip many frames ahead. So you pose at frame 1, and then maybe at frame 10 you do something else, like another extreme pose. And then maybe at frame 20 you do a totally different pose. There's advantages and disadvantages, of course, to both of these. Let's talk about the advantages of straight ahead posing. Now, like I said, straight ahead posing is you start at frame 1, then you go to frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and so on. The advantages are it's totally creative, and you get spontaneity out of it, and things may happen that you didn't really plan for it to happen, but hey, you're animating it, the body's moving that way, and you know it's happening. So don't stop it. Let it flow. Let it, do its own thing. You get the creativity, you get the spontaneity and the fluidity in animations that you don't get in pose to pose, because pose to pose is very planned. It's very structured. And straight ahead it's very free flowing, and it's not planned. Okay, you may have an idea of what you want your character to do, but you don't really care what time this character does it or how he gets there. And that's what straight ahead is good at. Straight ahead is bad at planning a shot. If you want this character to hit a certain spot at a very specific time, straight ahead's not that good, because you might miss it, or you might hit it earlier than expected. There's not really any control until you reach that point in time. Okay? So straight ahead is very hard to use when working with live action backplates. Say a film studio shoots footage of people running around in a big mayhem, and this car explodes. Well, the director says, well, there's a CG monster running around chasing these guys, and he steps on the car. That's why it explodes. That's why I want the monster to step on this car at this exact moment in time. Well, if you're animating in straight ahead, it's really fun. You have your monster going all over the place, scaring the people, and then all of a sudden a car explodes, and your guy's like, you animated your monster like over here, and he's not even at that point yet. So that's the problem with straight ahead. The other problem with straight ahead is if you're working with a director, and the director says, okay, let me see what you're doing today. And pretty much you only animated the first 10 frames because you're doing straight ahead. And you're like, well, this is all I have so far. And the director's like, dude, 10 frames? What the hell? I expected, I wanted to see a basic blocking of the scene, I want to see what this character is supposed to be doing. Well, you can't do that with straight ahead, because straight ahead is, the first pass is usually the pass. First 2 passes, and that's it. You don't give much room to change or to do any fixes. Now, what are the advantages of pose to pose? Well, you could probably figure it out. Pose to pose is very organized. You start at frame 1, jump ahead to maybe frame 10 or frame 20, create a totally different pose, and fortunately the computer fills in the gap for us. It fills in frames between 1 and 10. Unfortunately, it might not do what we want it to do. So that's the drawback of pose to pose. Say you want your character to see a ball on the floor, pick up the ball, and throw the ball. Okay? In pose to pose, you would create a pose at frame 1 of the character standing, looking at the ball. Frame 10, the character might be squatting and touching the ball. Frame 20, the character would be standing and his arm would be back, ready to throw the ball. Frame 30, the character might be throwing the ball. That's your basic scene, and then you would go back to maybe frame 5 and adjust that pose to make it look like he's naturally squatting to pick up the ball. And then go to frame 15 and adjust that pose, and then going back to the in-betweens and just filling it in. Now, this is a very organized way to pose a character, to pose your animation. But as you can see, it's kind of mechanical. You laid out your extremes already, and now you're just going back and adjusting the in-betweens. You don't get that fluidity, you don't get that spontaneity that you did in straight ahead. Pose to pose is kind of boring. That's the drawback of it. It's very organized. You know, you can show the director that this is what I'm planning to do in this shot, and he can approve it or disapprove it, and it's very easy to change because you only keyed, like 4 keyframes? So it's good in that sense, and it's good in a sense where if you're working with a live action backplate, you can, time your animation exactly to the moment where you want the character to be. So like you can pose your character to smash that car at that exact point in time. The drawback of pose to pose is you're just animating motions, and you got to go back and adjust the middle keys between them, and sometimes you lose the life of your character in pose to pose. So now you're thinking, well, if straight ahead sucks and pose to pose sucks, then how do I animate? What kind of method should I use? Well, hey, the best method to use is a hybrid method. The hybrid method of using straight ahead animation and pose to pose animation. What that means is, instead of animating every single frame, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or instead of skipping from frame 1 to frame 10 to frame 20, now we're going to animate maybe every 3 frames or every 4 frames. So now you get that advantage of free-flowing motion that you start from frame 1, and then maybe 3 frames later you're like, yeah, this guy's going to be in this motion. And then 3 frames after that he's going to be like in this motion, just keeping with the flow of the momentum of your character. But also that extra space in between. Say you keyframe at frame 1 and then you keyframe at frame 4. That extra space allows you to change things. So say the director says, okay, that animation looks good, but he's not reaching his mark. I want it to be a little longer here. So now you go in your dope sheet. You can look at your animation. It's separated by maybe 2 or 3 frames in between. Now you can shift those keys very easily. That's the hybrid method. It's very easy to edit, and you get that free-flowing animation going straight ahead. Now, the hybrid method, you still have to go back and adjust, but it's not like pose to pose where you go back in between and adjust the in-betweens. It's like working in layers. So first, you animate the major limbs, the major body motion. You leave out the stuff like the hair, or the fingers, or, the belly jiggle. Once all that major animation is done, and the director says, yeah, that's cool, it works out. Let's see the clothes now. Let's see how the clothes moves. Let's see how the fingers move, or his face. Then you go back in another layer, another pass of your animation. Work on the fingers for 1 pass. Go back again, work on the hair or the antennas, how they sway about in the 3rd pass. Then go back again, animate the belly jiggle or animate the clothes. Just keep going back and refining. That way, every time you go back, you're working on a different part of his body. And you're working on a straight ahead posing motion for that separate part. You're not working in a pose to pose fashion for the entire body. It's this way of working in layers that makes everything still free flowing, but it gives you the ability to change and to fix things, because when you show the director your full body animation of your major limbs, and if he doesn't like it, you change it. You don't lose any work. You don't lose the fingers or the antennas or anything else. And if he likes it, hey, that's done, Go to the fingers, go to the next thing. So hybrid method is very cool, and this is pretty much the way that almost every CG animator animates in. Timing will affect the message that you are trying to portray in your animation. The time it takes for one frame to pass will make a big difference in your animation, especially if you're animating at 24 frames per second. I think it's best explained in an example. So let's take a look at this one. Okay, so we have a close-up of a person's head, and we're going to set 2 keyframes. We're going to set one keyframe to be looking straight forward, and we're going to set another one to be looking off to the side. Now let's set the first keyframe at frame 1 and set the next keyframe at frame 10. If we play this, it looks like the person is turning his head pretty slowly, as if to just scan the room, pretty casual looking. Now let's go into our dope sheet and take these 2 keyframes, slide the one at frame 10 all the way down to frame 2. So now the 2 keyframes are right next to each other. So let's play our animation again. In an instant, the head goes from looking towards us to off to the left. And this is so incredibly fast that we can't really make any sense of it. This is almost mystical. It's like a magical thing. Maybe this guy's a ghost or something. Now let's go back to our dope sheet and separate the keyframes by 1 frame. So the first keyframe is at frame 1, and the second keyframe is at frame 3. Going back to our animation, his head is moving very quickly, as if he was hit by an extreme force. Maybe he got shot. Let's go back to our dope sheet and move the keyframes further apart. Let's make the second keyframe at frame 3 or 4, and now these keys are about 2 to 3 frames apart. Go back to our animation, and his head is snapping pretty quickly again, but not as much as before. So maybe this time it seems like the guy got punched in the face rather than shot in the head. Okay, now let's go back to our dope sheet and separate the keyframes by maybe 4 or 5 frames apart. And we go back to our animation. Now the head turns relatively quickly. He's not really struck by anything. He's looking as if he's surprised, or something startled him off to the side, and he's looking to see what it is. So before we go back to separate these keyframes even more, let's go in our graph editor, and we can see it's a constant line. Now let's make these tangents flat. So there's acceleration and deceleration. Now what this does is, if you look at the slope, it's now a lot steeper than before. So the action is going to be quicker than before. But we'll have some ease up and ease down action. And going back to our animation, yes, it does look quicker and it seems more natural. I like to definitely flatten my tangents out for the beginning and ends of my animation. It happens normally in between because the spline curve naturally smooths out by itself. But towards the end, the very last keyframe, usually it just truncates off. And if you want to ease out, definitely flatten out your curves at the very end of your animation. Okay, let's go back to our dope sheet and separate these 2 keyframes by maybe 6 to 8 frames. And going back to our animation, now the guy is more relaxed. He's turning his head, he's looking off to the side, and nothing much is going on, no big deal. Okay, now let's separate the keys by about 12 to 15 frames apart. As you can see, he's turning his head pretty slowly. Maybe he's like sinister. Maybe he's giving you the evil eye. This guy is serious. So now you see what timing is about. Your message can change depending on how far apart your keyframes are and how quick the actions are. Now keep in mind, this does change with scale. So if you're a little mouse, your legs would be moving a lot quicker than a person would. If you're a spider, your legs would move quicker than a mouse would. So if you go bigger now, if you're an elephant, you would move slower than a human would. Now keep in mind, this is because that the limbs need to be moving a lot more mass than before. A mouse is very light, so he can move very quickly and his legs can handle it. An elephant needs to move a lot of mass. Timing can also affect the style of your animation. Lots of times when you animate in a very realistic human motion, lots of times it's pretty slow. If you see a lot of motion capture in computer games, you'll notice that, hey, these guys are moving pretty slow for what they look like. If you make the timing of your keyframes to be a lot sharper, a lot quicker, it's much more stylized now. It'd be a lot more cartoon-like. That might be what you want, and it might not be. Timing is something you'll get with experience. It's very hard for me to tell you exactly how long one frame takes. You just have to do it a lot. I like to animate on 3s and 4s, meaning I like to key every 3 frames or every 4 frames. Like I said before, it gives me the ability to change my timing in the dope sheet very easily. And it also lets me keep in a groove when I'm animating. I'm not worried about what happens 10 frames from now. I'm worried about what happens 3 frames from now. So it's a lot more current. You're more focused on the momentum of maybe some limbs or the weight moving forward, things like that. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that there's a big difference between 30 frames per second and 24 frames per second. If you're going to animate for a film, you should definitely do it at 24 frames per second. If you're going to animate for video or maybe computer games, you should do it at 30 frames per second. When I started learning how to animate, I animated at 30 frames per second because everything I did went to tape. And when I started working on feature films, I found out that my animation at 24, what I would usually do at 30, it looks too slow, and I ended up shifting all the keys in a dope sheet to be closer together. So, just keep that in mind. It won't be a big change. It won't be a difficult transition going from one to the other, but, it's going to take maybe a day to get used to, and you'll be right there. Okay, now that you know the basics of animation and how to really go from one keyframe to the next, let's talk about how to make your animations look good, how to make the motions look natural and more believable. Okay, now that we've learned about the technical aspects of computer animation, let's learn about the artistic side. Now this is the fun stuff. This is why most people get into computer animation. And before we animate anything, we need a character. So let's first talk about character design and character development. The first thing you need to do is come up with a character. And you need to figure out what the character has to look like, and you need to figure out what kind of personality this character is going to have. So let's talk about the physical appearance of the character. The key to a good character design is appeal. The character must have appeal. Appeal doesn't mean the character has to be cute or it has to be good looking or beautiful. An evil character can have lots of appeal. What appeal means is it has to be pleasing to the eye. So if you like to look at it, if you like to stare at this character for a big amount of time, then it has lots of appeal. In many cases, a simple design has much more appeal than very complex designs. Now also consider your style of animation. If you want a very stylized type of animation, then a simpler character design would be much better. Say you have a photorealistic human that you want to animate. Now the audience is going to expect this character to move like a real human. If it looks photoreal, it should move just like a real human. If you have a human and it doesn't move just like a real human would, the audience would probably not believe your animation. There'd be some sort of disbelief going on there, and there's some sort of awkwardness. So if you want to do very stylized animation, you should do something very simple. Maybe a coffee bean with 2 guns. That's very simple. Keep that in mind. The more caricatured your character design is, the better it lends to more stylized animation and the more freedom you have. It's all about creating an illusion. If you create a character that's never been seen before, then nobody knows how it should really move. So you can animate this character any way you want. But if you create a photorealistic human, well, everyone knows how that should move. So if you can't make this character moving like a real human, then that illusion is destroyed. Now, going into detail about the physical appearance, you should really ask yourself what your character looks like. How old is your character? How tall is your character? How much does your character weigh? What kind of physical traits does this character have? Is this character a good climber? Is it a fast runner? Does this character fly? What kind of clothes would this character be wearing, and what kind of setting would this character be in? Would this character live in the jungle, or would this character live in a city? A cold city, a hot city? You need to think about these things. Also think about the animation in which you want to put this character in. It has to fit the same setting. It has to fit the same time period of your animation in order to fit with the environment. Now, once we get past the overall body shape, think about details that would make this character interesting. Try to tell a story with the character's appearance by itself. For example, if this character is a fighter, you could definitely show that with scars. Does he have scars on his face or on his body? That would show that he's been in a fight before. Is this character a curious character, or is he inquisitive? You might want to give this character big glasses with huge eyeballs or very tiny pupils so you can see this pupil moving around in this big glass sphere. That'll bring attraction to his eyes. Would this character be sluggish or move slowly with age? And maybe we should show some wrinkles or lots of fat, or maybe have this character hunch over, maybe have a hunch on his back. Once we figure out the entire physical appearance of this character, we can pretty much tell what this character does just by looking at it. We could tell what kind of role it's going to have in your animation. Now let's make this character much more complex. Let's develop this character. Going beyond the physical appearance, let's talk about the character's personality. Let's talk about the history of this character. Every character you develop, every character that you design, you should really write many pages of biography. You should write a history for this character. In addition to asking yourself, what does this character look like, you should also ask yourself, what kind of personality does this character have, and what kind of behavior does it have? For example, is your character stubborn? Is it impatient? Does it like to joke around? Is it serious? Is it easily irritable? Is it shy? Is it social? Is it stuck up? Is it petty? Is it violent? Or is it gentle or kind? Is it selfish? Also ask yourself, what kind of behavior does it have? Does it like to eat all the time? Does it like to sleep all day? Does it like to gamble and take risks? Is it a compulsive liar? Does it like to impress people? Does it like to exercise? Does it like to read? Does it like to go out and party? All these traits will help develop your character into a more complex one. A complex character is neither 100% good or 100% evil. A complex character is a mixture of both, but leaning towards one side. It's going to be relatively good with some evil in him, or relatively bad with an ounce of good in him. What this means is, say you have your hero, and aliens are attacking the Earth, and it's up to him to defend this Earth. Now, a very simple character would just go out and defend the Earth, and that's it. Very simple story. A very complex character would maybe hesitate before he fights the aliens. Maybe he's worried about dying when he fights the aliens. Or maybe he's worried about failing, and if he fails, then everyone else would die. Maybe he can't deal with the pressure of saving the whole world. Or maybe his father told him not to fight anymore, and if he did fight, he would lose the respect of his father. And leaning a little bit more towards the evil side, maybe the hero doesn't want to save the world because he has no interest in saving the world. Or maybe he wants to save the world to get fame, to win someone's love. Or maybe he wants to save the world in order to control the world himself. Now, everything I'm saying makes the character much more complex than a hero saving this world, which is a very flat, boring character. So definitely think of some inner conflicts for your character. Now let's show a little exercise. First, I'm going to design a character. It's a very simple one. And looking at his body, it's relatively simple. It's a humanoid character, kind of boring. When you look at it, you don't really think much. Now, say I want this character to be my superhero. Let's bulk him up a bit. Make him more lean. Let's make him more flexible looking. Make his torso longer, his legs longer, his fists bigger. Now he doesn't really look human anymore. He looks more comic book-like. Looking at him now, comparing him to the original, which one do you think would be better animated? Which one do you think would be doing more extreme movements? When you look at these two, you would pick the comic book character to be more animatable. Well, now that we have our superhero, he's a very athletic comic book character. Let's give him some personality traits. Let's say he's very arrogant, but he's not that intelligent. Already that's a comedy because he thinks he's the smartest, bravest, strongest superhero in the world, but he's a nitwit inside. Or he can be a very powerful, invincible superhero, but he's afraid of dirt. He's afraid of touching things and getting sick from them, getting some kind of disease or bacteria. So everywhere he goes, he can't really touch anything because he's like, yeah. So already you can picture the scenes that would come about in your animations with this type of character. Basically, creating your own character is lots of fun, so have fun with it. Think of a great story for your character, and man, just ideas will start popping in your head once you develop a great character. When posing a character, you need to be aware of the joint limitations. As an animator, I like to use skeletal setups without joint limitations. For example, say I bend this arm. If I wanted to, I could bend it further than I should be able to bend it. Doing this can sometimes show extreme poses for very short instances, like in punches and kicks. However, you must be careful not to bend it too far so that the limbs look like they are broken. As an animator, you must have a careful eye and know how the body should move and what the body should look like as it moves. Bending it this far is obviously wrong. Let's take a look at what happens when you use joint limitations. The arm is limited so it won't rotate past 0 degrees. Now as you rotate the arm past that angle, the arm just stops. It looks like the arm is being blocked by something very hard. Ideally, the arm should ease down to a certain degree when it comes to a joint limitation. That's why I always opt to have a setup without limitations, so I can control the body exactly how I want to. And when the animation calls for extreme poses, I can do that. What do I mean by extreme poses? Let's take a look at this hand, for example. Normally, the fingers can't bend backwards further than this. If you want to push the pose to be more extreme, you would flex the fingers back even more. Now this pose is much more expressive than before. There's a certain level of intensity in a pose like this. This may be physically impossible for a hand to do, but we're talking about animation. This isn't physical therapy. Taking our poses to the next level will make your animation more stylized and unique. Here's an example of where you would use a pose like this. Say we have a character who wants to cast a magical spell. Using an extreme pose in the fingers will accent when the magical spell is cast. As you can see, the extreme pose is very quick and it doesn't last long enough for the audience to see that the fingers are broken, but it lasts long enough for the audience to notice it. If we had limits on the finger joints, we wouldn't be able to be as expressive as we are when using extreme posing. There's one area in the body where we should be careful not to be so extreme, and that is in the rib cage. Normal people can use their clavicles to hunch their shoulders over and slouch a little, or pull their shoulders back and have their chest out. But they can't bend from the mid-rib cage area, or that mid-upper chest area. The reason for that is because the vertebrae in your spine are fused in the rib cage area. That makes the rib cage firm and strong enough to protect our internal organs like our lungs and our heart. If we could fold the rib cage, we would really hurt ourselves. So when you see a setup that has a joint in the center of the rib cage, be very careful on how much you use it. If you do use it very slightly. This is what happens when you use it fully. As you can see, the chest will compress in and be stretched out. When you twist from that joint, your chest will actually shear. Rotating from that joint is very abnormal looking. If you do use that joint, use it very slightly. Here's what the rotations look like if we don't have that extra joint in the rib cage. The rotations look much more normal and the rib cage more solid. If you're worried about your character looking too stiff, don't forget about the clavicle motion. That adds a lot of flexibility to the chest area. So as you can see, I totally omit that extra bone in the rib cage area. By doing so, I don't even have to worry about it, and I also have one less bone to animate. Now let's talk about the balance of your character. If we take a look at this character, he is in the default standing position, and we know he is pretty balanced and won't fall over by himself. How do we know he is balanced? Well, it mostly has to do with the center of gravity of your character. To explain this better, let's simplify the shape of our character. If we were to take this cylinder and spin it freely in the air, where would the pivot point be in this object? It would pretty much be in the center over here. This point is the center of gravity for this object. If we point an arrow straight down from the center of gravity, we can see that the arrow goes through the base of our object. The arrow really represents gravitational pull. By seeing that, we know the object is balanced and will not fall over by itself, because the weight is centered directly above the base. Let's further illustrate center of gravity with this pose. Again, let's simplify the shape. Now if we threw this object in the air, where would it rotate from? Pretty much from this pivot spot. That is our center of gravity. If we point an arrow straight down from that center of gravity, depicting gravitational pull, we see that the arrow does not go through the base of the object, but rather in front of it. This means that most of the object's weight is in front of its base, so most likely this object will tip over. We can fix this pose to be more balanced. To do that, we have to center most of the weight above the base. So now our center of gravity is directly above the base, and this pose is now balanced and will not fall over by itself. Let's take a look at this pose. This pose has a high center of gravity. When we simplify the shape, we can see that a lot of weight is balanced on a very small shape. Although this pose is balanced, it won't take much for this object to tip over. If this character gets hit with a force going horizontally, he will most likely fall over. If we took a look at this pose, it has a very low center of gravity. When looking at the simplified shape, we see a very big base, and most of the weight is on the bottom. So it will take a huge amount of force to push this character over. Now here is a common mistake done by beginner animators when animating a character doing a somersault. Often beginners will rotate from the root, which is usually the hip bone. As you can see, this is very abnormal looking. Simplifying the shape will definitely show us that. In this pose, the center of gravity is not the root of the character. It is more in the center of the collection of arms and legs and the rest of the body. So if we rotate the character from this pivot point, the somersault looks much more natural. Now how can you easily animate this? Just parent or constrain the character to a null object and position the character so that the null object represents the center of gravity. Now all you have to do is rotate that null object. Posing a character is sort of like acting. Different poses can mean different things. That's what body language is. You are communicating through your body pose. For example, if your character is standing up straight with his chest out, then he is feeling confident or proud. If your character is hunching over with his head down, then he is feeling depressed or ashamed. If your character is hunching over with his head up, then this character could be devious or sinister or planning something evil. Take a look at these next few frames and see if you can describe what is going on between the characters and what the characters are feeling. As you can see, poses are very important in animation, whether it is a quick pose like in extreme posing, or a very long pose depicting the character's feelings. We're working in 3D, and by the nature of 3D, our animations will have depth, right? That's not exactly correct. For example, in photography, pictures can look very flat. If we take a picture of a box and if the box is facing right at us, we can't really tell if it has depth or not. Even though we know the box is three-dimensional, the box definitely has depth, We can't see it in this photograph. But if we rotate the box and take a picture of it again, we now have a perspective view. We can see the depth of the box. We can see the corners kind of shrinking down as it goes off into the distance. This picture has lots of depth as compared to this picture, which is very flat. Same thing goes for our animations. If our poses look flat, it's not very interesting. Poses with depth are much more interesting. Also, if your limbs are symmetrical, if your pose is very symmetrical, it's very flat. For example, if the character is facing you with his arms out to the sides and both arms are doing the same thing, that's what we call twinning in animation. This is a very boring pose because it looks flat, both arms are doing the same thing. Nothing really is interesting in this pose. Everything in nature is not very symmetrical. There's a lot of asymmetry in nature. For example, trees are very asymmetrical. Mountains are very asymmetrical. You might think you are pretty symmetrical, but I could assure you, you're pretty asymmetrical. One arm might be longer than another, or one ear might be higher than another ear, okay? It's asymmetrical. You might not look it, but you are. Asymmetry makes things interesting because it's not a mirror of the other side. So in our poses, we have to be very asymmetrical. We can't really be a mirror of the other side. Even if our pose is very symmetrical, for example, if this guy has hands on his hips, let's rotate him a bit to show some depth. Now one side is bigger than the other because one side is closer to us than the other. That's very asymmetrical. And this pose shows lots of depth. Now one way to really see if your pose has depth is if you work in a silhouette, and if you can tell that there's lots of depth in the silhouette, then that pose has depth. Now what is a silhouette? Well, we can do it by turning our background bright white, and we turn off all the lights in our scene so our character is pitch black, or if we shade our character to be totally black. Now this is silhouette. This is kind of like a shadow of your character. You don't really see any details of anything between the outlines of your character. Now let's show a bunch of different poses. Which one shows more depth? If you look at this pose compared to this pose, which one shows depth? Of course this one, because you can kind of tell the vanishing of the lines type of thing in this pose. Let's show another pose. Do you like this pose or this pose? And of course this pose shows a lot more depth than this pose. This one is a little more difficult. Do you like the one on the left or the one on the right? Although these two poses show depth, the one on the right shows a lot more depth than the one on the left. If we look at the one on the left, the feet show depth, but the shoulders are pretty much square up facing the camera. If we look at the pose on the right, the feet show depth, the shoulders show depth, and the arm especially shows depth going back. This pose actually looks like we're looking at a corner of a box. Let's show an example of this box now. Which box shows depth? Of course, this is very easy. The box on the right shows a lot more depth than the box on the left. Box on the right, we could kind of picture the 6 sides of the box. The box on the left, we don't know if it has 6 sides or not. Let's stray from the animation topic and talk a little bit about lighting. Not only does your posing help in portraying depth, but lighting does also. If your light is just front on and your source is pretty much where your camera is, that lighting is very flat. Everything is evenly lit, and that's pretty flat. If we have our light coming from the side, well, that shows a lot more depth. You can see shadows, you can see contrast in your character. The basic lighting technique is a 3-point light. We have a rim light, which is named because it shows a rim around your character. It's pretty much a bright light shining from behind the character. It kind of creates this outline showing the surface of the side of your character. Then we have a key light that shines from above and to the side, and that's the brightest light in your character. And that shows a lot of contrast for the surface facing us towards the camera. After this, you can see one side is very dark, and we put in a fill light, which is much dimmer than the other 2 lights, just to fill in those shadows, to show detail in those shadows. And now, if you compare this lighting to this lighting, the one on the right shows so much more depth than the one on the left. And that's a big difference that lighting can make in your 3D animations. Okay, enough about lighting, let's go back to animation. Natural motion is not linear, it's not mechanical, it's very curvy. The human is made up of many joints that rotate. So if you rotate, say, an arm and you watch what the hand does, it creates an arc. And that's what we call arcs in animation. To make a motion look natural, we want to make sure all our limbs are moving in arcs. Even if you're trying to do a linear type animation like a punch, you're still going to get some arcing in your shoulders, or your fist might arc slightly. As you learned earlier, the differences in FK and IK. IK would mostly give you linear animation, and FK would give you mostly arcing animation. Let's look at these animations of a hand hitting a ball. We're going to use two examples, one using FK and one using IK, and we're going to have 3 keyframes for each example. Now for the FK one, let's have a keyframe at frame 0, and then a keyframe at frame 10 with it actually contacting the ball, and a keyframe at frame 20 with the ball traveling. So let's take a look at the result of this example, and as you can see, the hand follows a nice arc. Now let's show the same example using IK. The bones in the arm are IK constrained to a hand target. So at frame 0 we use the same pose, frame 10 we do the same pose for the IK target, and then frame 20 we do the same pose. Now the resulting animation is not that much different, but it's different enough for us to take notice. As you can see, there's a slight arc in the animation, but there's not this very round arcing motion. So using FK would be much more advantageous than using IK in this example. Now let's say you have to use IK. Let's say your shot dictates that you have to use an IK target in your arm. So what do we have to do now? We pretty much have to add 2 more keyframes between frame 0 and 10 and between 10 and 20. So if we take the IK target at frame 5 and pull it out, and take the target at frame 15 and pull it out, we can create our own arc. And that is the big disadvantage of using IK. If you want an arcing type motion using IK, you would pretty much have to set more keyframes than you would when using FK. You might think that arcs only really happen on the extremities of your body, maybe like the hands or the feet, but they happen everywhere where your joints rotate. So they happen in your torso, they happen in your shoulders, they happen in your hips, they also happen in your head. When you turn your head, it's very unnatural to make it linear. Looking at this animation, this is a very robotic looking head. Now if you put an arc in this head turn, it makes the motion look much more natural. Your actions in animation have to be clear to the audience. If your audience is not prepared for the action, they might be confused or they might miss your action altogether. So you have to let your audience know when your action is coming. That's what anticipation is. Anticipation lets the audience anticipate your next move. It's very important, especially in your primary action. Your primary action is the main action that you want to get across in your animation. Now, how do you show anticipation in an animation? Well, most of the time, it's the exact opposite motion of what you want to show. So, say you have a character who wants to punch someone. If you just have him punch, that could come as a complete surprise to people. It might be good in a fight. You can actually surprise your dude you're hitting and actually hit him. But if you're watching an animation or if you're watching any kind of show, the audience might be like, whoa, what just happened there? So you definitely have to give them an anticipation. You want to reach back with your fist and kind of wind up for a punch. And once your fist goes back, you definitely know this character is going to throw a punch. A classic example of anticipation is with a bow and arrow. Well, the arrow can't go anywhere unless you pull it back in the bow and then you release it and then the arrow shoots out. The anticipation is the pulling back of the arrow. The action is the releasing and the arrow shooting forwards. Another case where anticipation is the exact opposite motion of your action is, for example, a jump. When you jump, you kind of squat down before you leap up into the air. So you squat down into a tight little ball and then stretch out and just pounce out of there all extended. Scrunching up into a ball is the exact opposite of pouncing up and stretching out. Now, not all anticipation needs to be the exact opposite. Say a guy eats a pizza and it's gone bad, Now, we want to show a puking type animation, but how can you show the opposite of puking? You know, that doesn't really make sense. So you can make him turn green or have him just tighten up his face and he's like, ooh. Everyone knows the anticipation of puking. So that's one case where it's not the exact opposite motion. Let's show an example of how to make an animation clear with anticipation. Well, we have a character typing away at a keyboard. So what's going on here? What's the important action? Well, as we can see, you might have missed that. The important action was pushing that red button. It wasn't a grandiose action, so if we use anticipation to draw attention to that action, it's going to be much clearer. So let's go back to this animation and put in our anticipation. There you go. The action is very clear. The hand goes up, the finger goes up, and we're like, well, what's that hand going to do? Well, it must come down, and it comes down on that red button. That's what we want our audience to see because that's the primary action. Anticipation can also be used for comedy. When you surprise the audience, when you set the audience up for something to happen and that doesn't happen, something else happens, and that becomes funny. So let's watch this animation again, and let's show how anticipation might set up for some comedic act. So there you have it. That's how anticipation can work in your favor when you want to surprise somebody. This type of surprise happens a lot in movies, maybe a scary movie. Say you have a character that's going to open up a door and he's very scared of what's behind that door, and it builds up this whole anticipation of what is behind that door. So when he finally opens it and there's nothing in there but maybe a broomstick, he's totally relieved, and all of a sudden something pops out from behind him and eats him, and it's really scary. Let's talk about slow in and slow out, or ease in and ease out. So if you have a character who's at rest and he needs to start moving, he can't really get up to that fastest speed just like that. He has a lot of mass he needs to push in his body. So he needs to build up that momentum. So he starts out slow and accelerates. Now, as he's going, when he's in that high speed and he wants to slow down and stop, he can't stop on a dime because that's not natural. So he needs to slow down and ease down. Let's take a look at this animation of a person going from a squat position to a stand position. Now, if we show this animation without ease in and ease out, the resulting animation looks very robotic. It looks very mechanical. And if we compare this animation to a similar animation that has ease in and ease out, the one with ease in and ease out looks much more natural. Now, this animation is basically comprised of two keyframes, a squat keyframe and a stand keyframe. So by looking at the graph editor, the curves look very linear for the one that does not have ease in and ease out. Now, this is what the curves should look like to have ease in and ease out. As you can see at the beginning, there's an acceleration motion, and at the end there's a deceleration motion. Now keep in mind, this is for only one bone for the entire body. So you would actually need to go back to every single bone and add the ease in and ease out to the curves. Fortunately, this type of thing happens by default with your software because of our spline interpolation. But in the beginning and the end, there's no spline to interpolate from before your animation and after your animation. So you need to flatten out those curves. Start the curves totally flat with a zero tangent, so it gives that spline a chance to accelerate up or down. And same thing for the end of the animation. You want to zero out your tangents and flatten them, so it gives a chance for those splines to kind of ease down into a slow stop. Ease in and easing out is very important to making your animation look more organic. Basically, everything I'm telling you is important to making your animation look more organic, so I might say this a lot. A similar topic to ease in and ease out is a moving hold. Now, a moving hold is when you want the character to pause for an extended period of time, but you don't want to really make it the same keyframe. You want to keep your character moving. You want to keep it looking alive. You want to breathe life into your character. Let's check out that animation we did earlier. Instead of squatting to a stand position, let's have him stand and then squat and then jump up. Now, say from the standing position, we want him to squat for an extended period of time. If we don't put a moving hold in here, and this is something that I have to force the software to do because the software wants to make everything very smooth. It's going to put in a moving hold automatically. That's one thing to look out for. So I'm going to force it to have no moving hold and watch what happens here. If you look at the squat and when he pauses in that squat position, it looks like it's a still frame. It looks like I hit pause on a VCR or something, and that's not good animation. We still want to breathe life into our character. We want to show a little bit of motion in the character, even though he wants to stay in that position for quite a bit of time. So how do we do that? If we let the computer do it by itself, it looks okay. That's not bad for a rough pass, but let's do more. We're going to continue the motion of our limbs just very slightly as it was on the keyframe before. So if he's squatting down and we hit a nice pose, that's a cool pose that we want in our hold. So in our moving hold on a keyframe, maybe like 5 to 10 keyframes later, we're going to just keep that motion going. Everywhere the limbs were moving, say the arm was dropping back and his head was going down and his spine was curving, we're going to keep that motion going for just a little bit longer, making that pose a little more extreme, a little more exaggerated. His fingers might open up, they might arc back a little more. His foot might bend on the ball of his feet some more. Just these little things that are very minute, but when you play it in animation, it's very subtle and it's very fluid and your character looks like he's alive. This is something that's very important in computer animation because computer animation makes everything look so precise. If you have a hold that is completely still, you're going to think, hey, this is a still frame. In computer animation, you could tell when a pixel changes, so you need to move it very slightly. And a small amount of motion would definitely keep that illusion that this character is still alive. He's not frozen, or we didn't crash the computer or something. Let's show another example of a moving hold with our big dude. Say he's flipping over a big rock and we want him to pause in this majestic pose in the end, this really like superhero pose with his arms up after he just flipped over this big rock. If we have him just hold, it's going to look like a still frame again. Let's put a moving hold in. So he flips over this rock, and we have our great pose, and we think it's awesome, but hey, we need to make this pose moving. So in the next keyframe, maybe 5 frames or 6 frames later, we want to make this pose even more extreme. We want to bend his joints back even further. We want to pull his limbs out even more, stretch him out. Stretch him out more than we thought we can stretch him out. And that's a moving hold, and he looks great when we do this. Of course, this moving hold can go on for infinity, so we have to end it somewhere. So let's add this ease out in our animation. So at the very last keyframe, let's look in our graph editor and flatten out all these curves so we don't have to keep doing this moving hold. It could never end. And when we go back to watch our animation, this is the outcome. Now we're going to talk about squash and stretch. Anything fleshy will show squash and stretch. Muscles flexing, a cat pouncing, cheeks smiling. The important thing to remember with squash and stretch is that you must conserve the volume. So if it's a squash shape, it still must retain the volume it has in its original form. If it's a stretch shape, same thing. It must retain its volume. So an object that is squashed to become shorter must also become fatter, and an object that is stretched to become taller must also become thinner. Otherwise, if you squash it without conserving a volume or without making it fatter, it looks like the object decompresses, which is abnormal. Likewise, if you stretch it without conserving volume or without making it thinner, it looks like the object is being inflated, making it look like it's being blown up or something like that, and that's abnormal too. Now let's show an example with a ball squashing, but this is no ordinary ball. This is our Jello ball. and it's not going to squash like a normal ball. Otherwise, we would just squash it down in the y-axis and fatten it in the x and z axes. But no, this is our Jello ball. It's like a blob. We're going to use a technique in Animation Master. It's called pose sliders. Now, the idea behind it is we're going to deform our object with a slider. So how do we do that? Pretty much what we need to do is remodel our object into the shape that we want it to be deformed in. So, for example, for our Jello-like ball, in the squash position, we want to remodel it into a squash blob-looking thing. In our stretch position, we want to remodel it into a boogie-looking thing, like a snot or something. Let's do that. At one extreme of our pose slider, we have our squash, and we'll remodel it, pulling it down, pulling these points. It could be quick and dirty. Now, when we test it out, as you can see, I didn't conserve the volume, so we have to make this blob object fatter than what it was. So let's pull these points out, making it fatter. Test it again, looks okay. At the other extreme of our pose slider, we have our stretch position. So, stretch it out, we could scale this, pull these points, and that's our snot-looking object. In the middle of this pose slider is, of course, the default shape of our object. So now, when we animate this, say we drop this ball, and we want it to just splat on the ground. We definitely need to show contact points. A contact point is when one object is in a collision course with another object, you must have a keyframe where the two objects touch just before the impact. Otherwise, in your animation, you might miss the impact. So let's drop our ball. And in free fall, right now it's in its original form. And as acceleration of gravity takes its toll, it's going to pull this blob into a snot-looking form. Just before it hits the ground, let's go to that keyframe. It's going to be in its longest form, its stretched out shape. And we can do that with our pose slider. Just slide this slider all the way to the end and we get this nice looking, snot looking shape that's kind of touching the ground. Let's go maybe 3 frames later. And we want this not to just splat. So we shift our pose slider all the way to the other side and our object turns into a big splat. So make sure it's in contact with the ground and that's it. Now we play back this animation and plop. That's our Jello-like ball. It just plops on the ground. Now we can also add some more stuff into this. Let's add some jiggling of this ball. It's not made of pudding, it's made of Jello. So let's make this bounce a little bit. And going back to our animation, we can use our slider and just keyframe it up and down in various stages of blobbiness, say every 3 frames. And looking at our animation, we'll diminish the amount of our slider and it just tapers off, and that's our blobby looking thing with just our slider tool. And this is the result of our jiggling animation. Using the same technique, we can also make muscles flex, or we can make cheeks bulge out. Let's make a bicep flex by bending this arm. So first we need to remodel this arm with our pose slider positions. At the maximum, we're going to bulge out this bicep. Now you have to keep in mind again that the volume is conserved. So your muscle doesn't really grow bigger, it just squeezes more. It contracts and bulges out at the center. At the other end, the muscle is stretched, so we're going to thin it out and pull it apart. And the volume is still conserved, so the muscle shrinks in towards the middle and out towards the sides. Now, in coordination with our animation, whenever we bend this arm, we're going to slide this pose slider to contract our muscle. And whenever this arm relaxes, we're going to slide it back. We're going to stretch out this muscle. We can also clench this muscle. So if we bend this arm, we can shift our pose slider to maybe 75%, and that muscle looks like it's contracting. But if we want to clench it and really make it look like it's flexing really tightly, then we can go to the next keyframe, maybe 2 keyframes later, and increase it to 100. And the next keyframe, like maybe 1 keyframe after that, shrink it back down to 90, and a keyframe after that, grow it back up to 100. And keep doing that to make this muscle just tremble and flex with strength. That's how we can do this type of squash and stretch with our pose slider. For simpler things, it's not ideal to really keep remodeling your object. Say we have a simple character like this little dude here, and we want him to jump around, and we don't really want to remodel his entire body to a stretched out position or a squashed down position. So we can do that with scaling. So when he's squatting down before he jumps, we can scale his entire body down in Y and then make him fatter in X and Z. And when he's jumping, we can scale his body up in Y and thinner in X and Z, so it conserves the entire volume of his body. And at the apex of his jump, we can scale his body back down to 100%. And he's in free fall right now, so nothing's really happening to his body. So as he drops back down to the ground, he stretches out, gravity takes its toll, and we can scale him back up in Y and back down in X and Z, and he's touching the floor. And then a few frames later, we squash him down from the impact. So scale him down in Y, squash him up in X and Z, and he becomes fat. And now let's bring him back to a normal state as he stands up and scale him back to 100. And let's watch our animation. So that's a very simple, quick, and easy way to do squash and stretch in computer animation. Exaggeration is what animation is all about. If we didn't exaggerate in our animations and we wanted to just depict real life, then we might as well could have just rotoscoped, because exaggeration gives us freedom of expression. The more cartoony your character is, the more you can exaggerate, and the more rules you can break. Now, these are the rules of physics. You can break the rules of physics. You cannot break the rules of animation. Now, let's go through some examples of exaggeration. One example of exaggeration is when a character has his toe slammed with a hammer, and this character just screams out in pain. If you wanted to exaggerate, you can scale up the head of this character until it was disproportional to the rest of his body. You can also make his toe pulsate and throb, making it look like he's in lots of pain. Or if you see a character that sees something that really surprises him, his eyes could just bug out like crazy, something you can't really do in real life. Also, maybe if a rock dropped on a character's head, this character's head might totally flatten out and mold into the shape of the rock, something that can't really happen in real life. You can also exaggerate poses. For example, if this character wants to slam his fist down and he does it with great force, you can maybe have him take off from the air a bit and just hold that pose, make it look like such a great, powerful hit. Also, you can exaggerate flexibility. Say you have a superhero character who's supposed to be very limber, make him very stylized. You can exaggerate his posing. Exaggeration is a very easy thing to do in 2D because you're pretty much unlimited in the way you draw. You can draw your sketch any way you want, make his head bigger, pull out his arm for one shot or something like that. In 3D, things are a little more realistic because they have 3 dimensions. Now, this makes exaggeration a little bit more difficult. The ways you would do it would be using pose sliders, like I mentioned before, how to mold your character into something else with just a slider. You can scale, you can squash and stretch, things like that. But most types of exaggeration are going to be pretty difficult to implement because it requires you to remodel your character in some way that he's not really built for originally. Let's go through an example of exaggeration with these 2 mallets smashing this character's head into a little sliver. This is something very easy to do in 2D, but in 3D we have to make another model. We have to adjust our model to become this exaggerated piece. So first, let's make a pose slider and model the head into what we want it to look like after the mallets smash them. So create your pose slider and just pull all these points until we get the shape we want. Now, unlike squash and stretch, you don't really have to conserve the volume. Since we're deforming our model to something unrealistic, we don't have to adhere to the rules of realism. Now let's start animating. Let's have the two mallets come down so they're right in contact with the head. We also have to make sure the pose slider is keyed in its current form for this keyframe. Then 2 keyframes later, let's slide the pose slider all the way down so the head smushes in, and then let's smash the 2 mallets together. Then 3 or 4 keyframes later, let's recoil these mallets so it looks like they're bouncing, and also let's recoil the pose slider just a tad. Now when we play our animation, we see the head is deforming slightly before the impact. This is due to the spline interpolation of the pose slider, so let's go in our graph editor to flatten out this curve. After that, the head doesn't deform before the impact. Now some frames later, let's keep the mallets moving back, and let's take a quick look at this animation. Now let's add some vibration to this head after the impact. Let's wiggle the head every 2 keyframes. Don't worry about being exact, because we can adjust the motion in the graph editor. In the graph editor, we can taper off the motion by making it diminish over time. And this is our resulting animation. So this is a typical cartoony head smash by the 2 mallets. It looks pretty funny. We can add another thing in the end where he just holds his nose and tries to inflate his head using his own breath. That's it. His head pops back and he's okay. So exaggeration teaches you to be free in your animation. Not everything has to look realistic. Sometimes you just want to have fun. Now let's talk about one of the most difficult topics in animation, weight. Now you might think that weight really applies to the way the character walks, or if he jumps, like you see this weight come down. Weight not only applies to the character, but also what the character interacts with and what he collides with or what he picks up. Now, unlike exaggeration, where things are not very believable, they're very cartoony, if you want to apply lots of weight to your character, it makes it more believable. If you're going for a more realistic type of animation, weight is extremely important. So the more stylized your character is, the less you really have to worry about weight. But the more realistic your character is, for example, maybe say a horse or a photorealistic human, you have to worry about depicting weight a lot. Because if you don't get the weight right, if the horse looks like he weighs 10 pounds or he's made out of plastic and he's hollow inside, you know, you're going to break that illusion that you're trying to fool the audience with, that this horse is really there. So let's go through some very small exercises to show you how to depict weight in simple objects. We're going to use 2 different colored balls. The balls are pretty much the same size. One's a red ball, one's a blue ball. And let's roll the red ball into the blue ball. And you see the collision there. Now, which one do you think weighs more? You can't really tell. Pretty much it looks like these 2 balls weigh the same. Now let's roll this again, trying to depict a different weight. As you can see, the red ball just plows right through the blue ball as if nothing really affected its momentum. So which one looks like it weighs more? Of course the red ball, because it hardly got affected by the blue ball. So the blue ball must weigh a lot less than this red ball. And of course the final example is we roll the red ball into the blue ball. The blue ball hardly moves and the red ball just bounces right off. And of course the blue ball looks like it weighs so much more than the red ball. Now of course, to really understand weight, we have to talk about some laws of physics. There are 3 main laws in physics that we really have to abide by and understand. The first one is an object in motion stays in motion. Meaning an object has a certain inertia, it has momentum. So there's an energy in it that keeps it rolling, and it's going to take some sort of energy to make it stop rolling. The second law is energy is neither created nor destroyed. It is merely transferred. So if you have a red ball collide into a blue ball and they both weigh the same, then the red ball is going to transfer all its energy, all its momentum into the blue ball. And the blue ball just takes that and starts rolling on its own. So when you stop something from moving, all that energy from its momentum has to go somewhere, and it's going to get transferred into that object that stops it. So if that object weighs a ton, it's going to absorb that energy. If that object is pretty light, it's going to take all that energy and get thrown back. And the very last law in physics is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. For example, if you have a gun and you fire the gun has lots of recoil. It shoots out the bullet, but the power of forcing that bullet to shoot out has the opposite reaction on the gun, so the gun jolts back. The reason why the gun doesn't fly back as fast as the bullet shoots out is because the bullet is very light. The gun weighs a lot more than the bullet. So it takes a lot more energy to move the gun than it does to move the bullet. Let's talk about gravity. Gravity is a constant force, so it's always pulling down. You don't need to really have a starting force like firing a gun to push that bullet out. There's going to be an attraction towards the ground all the time. Now, a common mistake for showing drops with heavy characters, if a heavy character jumps off a chair and he lands, the common mistake for beginner animators is to make a lot of bounce in his legs. So they would make the character jump off the chair, hit the ground, and you see a lot of hip motion going down and up, kind of like a bouncy type thing. That doesn't show a lot of weight. It kind of shows a very light character. To show a lot of weight, try it yourself. Jump off of a chair and see what you do. Do you bounce up and down? Not really. Your legs kind of stab the ground and support your weight. Because the thing you have to be aware of is that not only are your legs supporting your hips, but they're supporting your stomach, your chest, your head, your arms. Every single part of your body weighs something. Everything has mass. So as you hit the ground, all that mass is not stopping at once. They're still going down. So there has to be a hard edge when you drop and when you show a lot of weight. So let's show this jump off the chair again and show this variation. Now when you see this character hit the ground, he pretty much stabs the floor with his feet and his body motion just stops. It doesn't really recoil back up. It just hits, he stops, and then maybe he eases back up. This shows a lot more weight than the other one. Let's take a look at the bouncy version of this animation again, but let's look at it with the graph editor in real time. Now we're looking at the blue curve. That is the translation going up and down. As you can see, it's relatively smooth. You have the curve going down and then coming back up in a nice U-looking curve. And that's not too realistic if you want the character to look very heavy. What this does is it makes the character look pretty light and pretty bouncy. Now on the other hand, if you look at the very heavy looking animation, the blue curve does not come back up in a very smooth U-like curve. Now it looks like it drops and it doesn't really ease down, and it kind of stops and stays at that level plane for the rest of the animation. And as you can see, there's a lot of up and down motion in that blue curve after he lands, and that creates a very wobbly looking type of animation. There's a lot of weight, there's a lot of fat jiggling around in this character. Now let's talk about picking up heavy objects. Let's show an example of this small light character trying to pick up this heavy boulder. To this character, the boulder weighs a lot compared to his own body weight. So you must use a lot of leverage when picking up a heavy object. Now how would a character pick up this heavy thing using leverage? Well, he would bend from the hips, bend his knees. Pretty much everything comes from the hips. All motions really come from the hips. So if we make the hips move first while keeping the rest of the spine more or less down to pick up this boulder, we can kind of layer this animation. So let's move the hips first, then the mid-back, then the chest. And you get this kind of dragging motion. Doing this really shows that the hips are moving first. Now this is kind of going into our next topic, which is called overlapping motion. But pretty much the principle is not everything moves at the same time. If we were to move the hips and the chest at the same time to pick up this boulder, watch what happens. The boulder looks really light, and it looks like this character picked it up without any effort at all. If we separate the keys, if we lag the chest behind, it looks like this character is really straining. Looks like this boulder is forcing the character's chest to lag behind. This is sort of where power comes in. Say you have a power lifter and he wants to lift this rock up and he can't do it slowly because it's just too heavy. So somehow he has to create momentum with his body to get this rock off the ground, because gravity is pulling this rock, but he wants to pull the rock in the opposite direction. Remember the one law of physics, an object in motion stays in motion. So let's start with a downwards motion, some anticipation before he pulls up with the rock. So now, if we show him accelerating up, that gives us a sense of momentum, helping him pick up this rock. Now in the standing position, when he gets the rock up, he can't really stand totally straight up and down because that rock is more or less in front of him and it's going to tip him over. Remember, center of gravity. When he's standing up straight, where is his center of gravity? Pretty much dead in the center. If we have the rock in front of him, that center of gravity is more or less in front of him. So he has to really balance that out by arcing his back and putting some of his weight behind him while this big rock is in front of him. And now he's pretty balanced. We can also stabilize his balance if we spread out his feet too. Then his center of gravity spreads out between the 2 feet rather than being in this one small pivot area. Now let's see a different character pick up this boulder. Let's get our big dude to pick up this boulder with one hand. As you can see, it doesn't take much effort for him to pick it up because he's so much bigger than this boulder. As he bends sideways to pick up the boulder, what is his other arm doing? Well, it's sticking out more to counterbalance himself. Because remember what I told you when posing a character and the center of gravity. If you bend this character sideways to pick up the boulder without counterbalancing, like say his arm is down, where is the center of gravity? Well, you can see that it's pretty much between the boulder and his leg. So if he picks up the boulder, that boulder no longer supports the ground. It doesn't touch the ground. It doesn't support this monster. And all this weight is now tipping over. If he doesn't counterbalance with his other arm, then all that weight is going to tip over. He's very unbalanced then. Now, we want to show some sort of weight when this character is picking up the boulder. If we were to pick up the boulder like this, that's extremely easy. The boulder looks like it's pretty light. Even though this character is very strong, this boulder looks like it weighs nothing. Now, going back to what I said with the small character, making his hips move first, then his mid-back, then his chest, let's do the same thing for this bigger character. Just like how we did with the green guy lifting a rock, we're going to lower this blue guy to get some anticipation. And we're also going to lower him so he has some room to accelerate upwards. So the hip, the stomach, the chest, everything goes down. On the next keyframe, we're going to have the hips go up, but we're going to have the stomach and chest still going down. Now that gives us a sense that the hips are moving first. The hips are the things that are going to generate the power. So on the next keyframe, the hips is still going up, and the stomach now helps lift up this rock, while the chest is still dragging down behind. And look at the arm. The arm is straight now. Now what that says is the rock weighs a lot, and this blue guy can't just use his bicep strength to lift up this rock. So his arm is going to go straight, because his arm by itself cannot support the weight of the rock. That's why he's using his hips and his stomach and his chest to help him lift the rock. And on the next keyframe, the hips are pretty much done lifting, but the stomach is still going, and now the chest starts lifting. And as we can see, the rock starts moving up, and it's going to have a momentum all of its own, so it's going to act like an independent type of object linked to this blue character. Then on the next keyframe, the stomach more or less continues, but it starts to slow down, and the chest is still lifting, going back. And in the next keyframe, we have the stomach at rest, while the chest is more or less easing down, but still lifting. And we can see the rock is in motion going back. And in the next few keyframes, the arm comes to rest, everything comes to rest and eases down. Let's take a look at these two animations. They're pretty much the same, but there's one subtle difference. The animation on the left, the arm stays bent for the entire time that the rock is being lifted. Animation on the right, the arm straightens out, and then it starts to bend. Now upon closer inspection, if we look at the animation where the arm remains bent the entire time where he lifts up the rock, it looks like his arm is strong enough to hold this rock up. So now we're thinking the rock is pretty light. And in this animation, it looks like the rock is maybe hollow or something. It's pretty light. He can control it with his bent arm throughout the whole animation. But on the animation where his arm is straight when he initially lifts the rock up, it creates the illusion that this rock is still heavy and his arm alone cannot lift the rock up. So he has to use the rest of his body in coordination with his arm to lift this entire rock up. And it makes this rock look a lot heavier than before. The important thing to remember is that every part of the body weighs something. And when you attach an object to that body, that object's weight becomes part of the rest of the body. So you must take that into account when animating characters who interact with different objects. The next topic of overlapping motion and follow-through pretty much goes hand in hand with weight. Now, things don't all stop all at once. For example, if I punch a wall and my hand stops instantly, well, my sleeve still wants to go forward and my skin even wants to go forward. This is quite a problem in 3D because everything is based on a wireframe model. Everything moves together. If you attach a wireframe model to a skeleton, those bones are going to move that model, and you're not going to really get a lot of follow-through in that. Well, new technologies in computer animation allow the computer to automate those processes for you. For example, particle hair flows behind a character. Soft body dynamics allows the character's skin to jiggle. Maybe it's fat to bounce up and down. But sometimes as an animator, you must rely on your own skills, and sometimes you don't have those features in the software. Also, it really depends on the time and budget of your production. For example, if you have a shot where a fat monster is stomping on a car, well, you have to weigh the balance between doing a lot of the research and development to make the belly jiggle, to make the skin jiggle when that monster stomps on a car, or just hand animating all that belly jiggle. Now you have to keep in mind, if the director is very picky and he likes to change things, you might want to automate this, because if you know that you're going to have to change it many times, animating fat and belly jiggle is very tedious, it's very time consuming. So you probably want to automate that. But if you have the animation approved and the director's like, okay, just animate the belly jiggle, and that's all you really have to do, and you only have one shot to do it in, then it might not be worth all the research and all the development to put the belly jiggle in using the software features. It might be easier just to animate that. The smart thing to do is definitely animate the body first and worry about belly jiggles later after the animation is approved. That's going back to working in the hybrid method of working in layers. So every part of your body has some sort of weight. Your hands might weigh maybe 5 pounds. Your arms might weigh maybe 15 pounds. All of that stuff doesn't stop at the same time. If I fall on the ground, my body just doesn't stop. My arms bounce around, my hands bounce around, my fingers bounce around, my head would bounce around. And if you wanted to add clothes bouncing around, well, damn, that's going to be hard unless you have a cloth simulation. That's why in the old days you saw a lot of bald characters with no hair and lots of characters wearing skin-tight clothes. So there was no follow-through in that, because animating that by hand is very difficult. So let's go through an example showing follow-through. Let's have our little small character and let's put antennas on him. And in each antenna we have 3 joints, and let's make a little ball at the end of this antenna. So it shows that this antenna has some weight at the very tip of it. So first I'm going to show you how to animate this the easy way. Let's start with this character. Say he's in midair and he's dropping towards the ground. He's dropping, his body is elongated, his antennas are straight up because the wind drag is causing friction while gravity is pulling down. You know, everything straightens out. On the next keyframe, we're going to keep the same exact pose, but we're going to drop them down and just contact with the floor. Now, to keep the same pose, we're going to keyframe every single bone in his body just by nudging his bones. This is using the auto keyframing method. So the antennas, we're going to make sure that they're all keyframed and just nudge each bone a little bit just to set the keyframe. On the next keyframe, we're going to have his body compress from the weight of dropping onto the floor. We're going to bend his body forward. And we're going to bend the antennas back because the antennas are being dragged by air friction. On the next keyframe, we're going to compress him a little more, but decelerate his body this time, and the arms go forwards. And because of the deceleration, we're going to bend the antennas forwards because the antennas have a weight at the end of it. And on the next keyframe, let's show this character in the process of getting back up. And his antennas are kind of being dragged behind, so they're bending forwards too. And the last keyframe, let's have the character standing up straight. And his antennas are straight. Okay, now let's play this animation. It doesn't really look correct. You know, his antennas don't look like they're really dragging behind. So that's where the dope sheet comes in. And you know what the dope sheet's good for. It's good for shifting keyframes. So when we open up our dope sheet, we're looking at all the keys. It's very organized. I can definitely tell which frames my character is keyed on. Now let's pick the antennas and pick all the keys for both the antennas. And let's shift these keys maybe 2 frames later, shifting all the bones in the antenna. Now let's play our animation. And since the animation for the antennas is offset by 2 frames, it really does look like it's being dragged behind. This is a very easy way to show follow-through. Doing it in your normal poses and then shifting it in your dope sheet to make it drag behind. Yeah, it looks okay. Now let's do it in a much more fluid way. So we have 3 bones in this antenna. Let's offset the keys for every single bone. Keep the base bone keyframes where they are. The mid bones in the antenna, let's take the keyframes and shift them by 1 frame so they're lagging behind the base. Let's pick the top bone and shift its keyframes by 2 frames. So it's lagging 2 frames from the base. Now when we play it, looks like the antennas are very, very fluid. Looks like everything has drag now. These antennas are pretty flexible. If we wanted to make these antennas look more organic, now not everything moves at the same time. So if these 2 antennas are moving at the exact same time, it's kind of weird. Let's offset each antenna now. So pick all the keys for 1 antenna. Let's say we pick this antenna. We're going to pick all 3 of these bones. I'm going to pick all the keyframes for these bones and shift them by maybe a frame or 2. These keys no longer match the other antenna's keys. If we play this again, the keys are just slightly offset and it looks more natural now. It's not very symmetrical anymore. It's pretty organic and asymmetrical. Now keep in mind, we're not only showing overlapping motion in the antennas, but also in the arms, also in the chest. It sort of works in a chain. When the hip stops, the chest is still moving. When the chest stops, the arms are still moving, and so on and so forth. So overlapping motion is not only for small things, it's also for big things. So now you know the basics of overlapping motion and follow-through, and as you can see, it's a very tedious thing to do. So if you're just starting to learn how to animate, I suggest you get a character that doesn't have many things that overlap. For example, get a character that's not fat, doesn't have hair, doesn't have clothes. That doesn't mean that you don't have to worry about follow-through and overlapping motion, because other things would overlap. For example, if you jump and you land, your arms would definitely overlap the rest of your body. If you fall onto the ground, your legs and your arms would overlap the rest of your body. Your head would overlap. Lots of things overlap, but these are much bigger limbs. They're not very small details that you have to worry about, like clothes and hair. So focus on the big things first, and then later on go back and do the little things to add more details. Let's talk about the staging of your animation. When you stage out your animation, you want to force the audience to look at exactly what you want to show them. There's a lot that goes into staging. The camera angle, how far the subject is from the camera, what kind of action is being performed, things like that. For example, if the camera's pretty wide and you can see the entire body of your character, well then the audience is going to expect to see the entire body moving. They're going to expect something out of this entire body. But if your camera is very close up to the face of this character, then the audience is going to expect to see something going on in the face of this character, something important going on. For example, maybe a fight scene, you would probably want to show a very wide shot showing the entire bodies of these two characters fighting. And in a very emotional dialogue scene, you would probably want to see a close-up showing emotion in the face while the body's not really doing too much. Now let's go into more detail with staging. Now that we can literally point the camera to what we want the audience to look at, we also have to do it in our animation. We have to make our animation clear enough so that they see what we want them to look at in our animation. For example, let's show this character taking a coin out of his pocket. In this animation, it's not very clear. You might say, hey, I can see this coin. I can see him take the coin out of his pocket. But compared to this action now, you can see that he takes the coin and shows it to the side, which is much more visible than showing it in the front of him. What's the reason for that? Well, say he's a green character and he takes out a green coin. It could get hidden in his body if our lighting is not good. But if we have the coin shown towards the side of him, hey, that's very clear. His arm is sticking out there. It's making his body look disproportional. And it's an unbalanced pose. So it keeps our eye moving. We're not going around the outline of his body. We're looking at this unbalance towards the side. It could be like a magician wearing a very big black coat and very bright white gloves. Now, he doesn't want you to see what's going on under his coat. He wants you to look at his hands, That's where all the trickery comes in. So just like working in a silhouette for posing for solid drawings or solid poses, we can work in a silhouette for staging. So compare these two animations. We show this guy taking out a coin in this pose, and we show a guy taking out a coin in this pose. Which one is clearer? Well, definitely we can't tell what's going on in this pose. Everything's like pitch black. I don't know what he's taking out. In this pose, we definitely can tell he's taking out some sort of circular object. So that's a good test for your animations to see if they're clear or not. If you want the primary action to be very clear, you must work it out in a silhouette. If it's clear in a silhouette, if we could tell what's going on in a silhouette, we could tell what's going on in a normal animation. Otherwise, things might get hidden, things might get confused. The audience may not know if they really should look at something. You really have to force the audience to see what you want them to see. Here's a little tidbit about opposite staging, where you want to hide things that the audience is not supposed to see. For example, in the old Western fight scenes where you see a guy punch out another guy. Well, the two actors aren't really punching each other out. There's no contact with the fist to the face. So they have to stage it in a way where the contact point is hidden to the audience. You don't really want to show this in a profile because you could tell how much air is in between the fist and the face. You want to hide that fact. And if we stage it this way, where one guy is obscuring the other guy, we don't see that gap of air between the fist and the face. We think this guy is really hitting the other guy. So that's another example of staging. It's kind of the opposite effect we're talking about for animation, where you're hiding the primary action from the audience and you're making them think that something is going on that's not really going on. But usually for animation, we use staging for clarity of our actions. When we want to make sure the audience sees our action, we stage it so it's bright, clear as day. Let's go a little bit into acting and talk about secondary actions. Now, you have your primary action, which is the action you want the audience to see. For example, if you want a character to punch something, well, punching is your primary action. You can add a secondary action. Maybe he rolls up his sleeves and winds up before a punch. That adds a lot of personality to this character. A secondary action complements the primary action. It doesn't really compete with the primary action. If your secondary action competes with your primary action, then the audience would be confused to which one is more important. They would be like, okay, was it important that he rolled up his sleeves or that he punched this guy? Your secondary action has to help out your primary action. An example of where a secondary action can compete with a primary action is when this guy is drinking a bottle of water while he's punching. They're both happening at the same time. Which one's more important? Are we supposed to see that this guy's punching, or is that this guy is drinking this bottle? What's in the bottle now? I don't get it, you know? That's where the secondary action is competing with the primary action. We can fix this if we separate those actions by time. Say, for example, he drinks first, then he tosses the bottle, then he punches. Well, now the drinking of the bottle becomes a secondary action because it's like he's quenching his thirst before he does this athletic act. It no longer competes with the punch anymore. It becomes more complementary than being in a competition. So secondary action is more in tune with acting. You should know your character well. I mean, your character might not be the type to drink a bottle before he punches. He might not be the type to wind up before he punches. Maybe if your character is, really calm and cool, maybe instead of winding up for a punch, he takes off his sunglasses first and then punches the guy. Or maybe this guy is like so arrogant that he can defeat his opponent. He looks at his watch and then yawns and then he punches the guy. So if you know your character well, then you should be able to come up with many different types of secondary actions that would fit your character and that would complement your primary action. Let's talk about this little thing called rotoscoping, which is an evil term to most animators. But to beginners or to amateur animators, rotoscoping can actually help you out. It can actually help you learn. In terms of animation, rotoscoping is the copying of some pre-recorded motion. It's sort of like tracing a picture, but in 3D animation, you match your character's pose to the one that's on the pre-recorded video. So say I record myself doing the spin kick, then I import that video into my animation software and pose my 3D character to match the one on the video. Now I wouldn't do this for every single frame. I would recommend doing it at every 3 frames or every 4 frames, so it makes it easier for you to edit. If you rotoscope it for every frame, then editing it would be just like editing motion capture, which is very difficult and a pain in the butt. So here, I'm matching every 4 frames of the video. After you're done, you get pretty much the same motion that is in the video. And that's pretty much what rotoscoping is. It's the copying of motion. Now, expert animators don't like to rotoscope, simply because they don't need to. Just like how expert artists don't like to trace. It's kind of like an insult to your art. Some people think it's cheating. But rotoscoping does help you learn animation when you're just starting out. It helps you learn timing, it helps you learn body momentum, and it helps you learn posing. I admit I rotoscoped a lot when I first learned how to animate. I don't rotoscope anymore because after a while you start to know what the body should be doing and how it should look. But in the beginning it's a great tool to learn from. It's also a great tool for learning how to animate a creature that you've never seen before or never animated before. For example, let's say you wanted to animate a fiddler crab. Well, you might not really know how a fiddler crab moves, so rotoscoping is a good way to get accurate motion in your animation. If you don't wish to rotoscope, it would still be a good idea to watch lots of video reference, so you can not only learn how the crab moves, but also how it behaves. If anything, rotoscoping can be a good learning experience. So, it's a great tool. Don't ignore it. Don't be too humble to use it. But be aware that if you do use it, it's going to limit your creativity. You're not going to have a freedom in your animation. You're just going to be copying. And as a true artist, nobody really wants to copy. They want to create. So use it wisely, okay? Well, that's all I have to say for now. I know that's a lot of information to absorb, and don't get frustrated if you don't get it the first time around. Fortunately, this is a DVD, so you don't have to rewind anything. And animation, it's a tough subject, and it's going to take a lot of time to learn. So be patient, practice a lot, and have fun. You gotta have fun with animation, or else why do it, right? Hi guys, and welcome to the third section of our animation training. So now that we've learned all the principles and all the techniques and all the methods and all the tools, we're going to put them to use. We're going to do a complete animation from beginning to end. And this is the animation that we're going to do today. It's a drop from the sky, land, jump up, and do a side kick. Now I'm going to pause this right here, and I'm going to describe to you what we're going to do. So don't ingrain this in your head too much. Now the character is going to drop from the sky, and he's going to land into a cool pose, and then we're going to give him some life in his pose. Then he's going to jump up and do a powerful side kick. And then that's the end of our animation. So why don't we stop talking about it and let's start doing it. So we have our character in the default position. So the first thing we're going to do is raise him up into the air. And since he's in mid-fall, he's going to be caught by air drag. So let's bring his arms up so they're being dragged by air friction. And now let's turn his fingers into a more neutral looking pose rather than a really flat looking pose. Let's do the same thing for the other arm. Let's put his fingers in a more neutral looking pose too. So let's tilt his head down so he's looking where he's going to land. And let's give his torso an arc so it doesn't look so asymmetrical. Give him a more dynamic looking pose. And that should be good enough for the first keyframe. So let's go to the next keyframe at frame 6. Spread out his feet so he's more balanced when he lands. Okay, scrubbing through. That's what it's going to look like. It's going to be hard to judge what it's going to look like this early. So spread out the feet a little more, fix the knee. Okay, let's straighten out his torso because of air friction. And let's straighten out his arms slightly more so that we're saying he's at his fastest speed at this point in time. Okay. And this is a scrub through. Now go to frame 10 and we bring his hips down slightly more and arc his torso upwards so it's being dragged behind. And arc his arms back. They're being dragged still. Now when we scrub through, not quite sure what it's going to look like yet. It's too early in the game. Let's drag his head a bit. Okay, let's go to frame 13, 3 more frames ahead. And we're going to follow through with the torso. The hips are pretty much stopped. They're decelerated. The head is still dragging behind. The arms, let's see. Okay. Scrubbing through. It looks kind of weird right now. Let's bring his hips back a bit. There's like a whipping motion in the torso. We'll have to fix that later. Might be too quick. Let's bring his arms midway between a drag and a follow through. So the arms aren't moving too fast. Okay, we scrub through. Looks really awkward here. Between frames 10 and 13 looks really quick. So back at frame 10, let's bring part of frame 13's motion into frame 10 to lessen that sharp whipping action. Okay, let's bring him down in 13 to show more deceleration. There's a weird horizontal motion in the hips right now. So let's bring him back in frame 10. Okay. Let's move on to frame 16. The arms will be doing most of the follow through here, and the stomach and chest come to a halt. Let the arms flow back. And we scrub again. The drop seems kind of odd. What is missing is the contact point, the point where the feet touch the floor, and that's missing in our animation so far. So let's go back to frame 6 and make this keyframe the contact point. And this is the keyframe where the character just touches the ground. He's still dropping, but his feet just touch the ground. Okay, it looks better. There's better deceleration in the hips now. Let's drag the chest back more in frame 10 so we get more of a whipping action in the frames ahead. Okay, let's do the same for the stomach, add more drag. Okay. Let's add even more drag here. Before we move on, let's give frame 16 a more natural pose here. So let's arc his torso a bit, give his spine a more neutral bend instead of a straight-on pose. Let's readjust his head to the new pose. Alright, that's what it looks like so far. Let's move on to frame 21. And notice I go 5 frames ahead now instead of 3. And that's because our motion will be slower in frame 21. Things will come to a rest. Basically, I'm keying the entire body just by nudging each joint. This is using the auto key method. And this frame will be our moving hold for the land position. Now the right arm will be the active arm, so it won't drag too much. The left arm will be the passive arm, so it will drag back much more. Active means I'm exerting my muscles. Passive means I'm just letting my arm swing back without exerting my muscles. Okay, let's play back in real time. And notice that the torso still seems to be snapping down. We need to smooth out that area. What it looks like is the keyframes between 10 and 13 are too close. So I need to put more time in between them. In the dope sheet, slide the keyframes at frame 10 to be at frame 9. And in real-time playback, it looks better, but there's still a slight snapping motion. So back in the dope sheet, slide the keyframe at frame 9 to frame 8. Now we have 5 frames separating frame 8 and frame 13. Although it still thinks the keyframe is at frame 9, we can double check in our dope sheet and see that the keys are really at frame 8. So don't worry about that too much. In real-time playback, yeah, that's much better, much better. Now that we fixed it, the animation has a lot more energy, a lot more oomph. Follow-through looks good with some slight snapping energy. The character has weight. You can feel the weight in the upper body. Let's adjust his right arm to look stronger in the pose at frame 21. Let's play with the head posing. No, that didn't work. Let's bring it back. We want the head to have weight from the land and then come back to their normal position. Okay, make the right foot look more natural so it's not stuck in a perpendicular pose. After that, let's readjust the knee. Now, scrub from front view. Make sure you check your animation from all views. You might miss something if you don't. Okay, tweak the pose a little more. Adjust the left knee. Tweak the arm a little more. Okay, the pose looks good. I want the character to hold this pose for a while now. So let's skip ahead to frame 50. That will give us about 1 second of hold. Now I key the pose by just nudging all the major bones. By nudging instead of just hitting the key button, I can add a very slight motion to the pose, so it changes naturally and not mechanically. And don't forget to key the knee and feet targets. When I scrub, I can see that there's a slight motion during the hold, but the feet are really sliding around. To fix the feet from sliding, go in the graph editor and flatten out the feet targets for both translation and rotation. As you can see in the animation curves, that there's a slight arc from frame 21 to frame 50. So flatten out the curve for both keyframes. When we scrub again, it looks like the rotation is fixed, but the translation is not. So go back in the graph editor and flatten out the translation curves. We just did the rotations previously. Notice the same type of arc and curve in the translation. So select both keyframes and change their interpolation to flat. When I scrub now, we can see that the back foot is fixed. Now I have to fix the front foot. So select the keys and flatten the interpolation. Okay, in real-time playback, looks good. Feet are sticking, no motion. Okay, let's move on to frame 54. From here, I want the character to jump up. So first we have to add an anticipation for the jump. So I'm going to make the pose to be compacted in and also have the arms flow back. The arms are going to create momentum to help launch this character up. Okay, on scrub back, the right arm moves too quickly. So let's split the difference and bring the right arm back in halfway. Let's have the left arm move independently of the right. So let's pull this arm back even more. Let's go ahead 6 more frames because I want this anticipation to last a while so the audience will notice it. Pull the hips back to add the anticipation. Move the right arm back all the way to complete its anticipation. Crunch the body in a little more. Nudge the left arm back a little more. For these joints, I'm applying a moving hold for their anticipation. Okay, scrub through the animation. Let's pull the hips back a little more to give the character a bigger anticipation. Go to frame 54 and do the same so the anticipation starts earlier. So by the time it gets to frame 60, the hips going back should be slowing down. Okay, scrub back. Heck, let's make them more extreme. Let's pull them back even more. Now we're animating. Readjust frame 54. Okay, now he looks good. Now he looks like he's going to spring forward. The pose is more dynamic now. Scrubbing through again, the left arm looks a little static. Let's give it some motion. So frame 50, which is the end of our held pose, let's bend his arm a little bit. So when we go into anticipation, the arm has room to move back and doesn't look so static. In frame 54, let's bring the arm back slightly to give it more flow. Real-time playback. Okay, it looks good. Let's move on. So go 4 more frames ahead to frame 64. Now the character will launch up. Move the hips up and move it forward. Right now he's only using his leg power to move himself. Let's start to bend the spine in the opposite direction to get that slingshot effect. Go back to frame 60 and make sure his clavicles are stretched back. This is purely for dynamic appeal. At frame 64, we're going to swing the clavicles down because the arms will be swinging like a pendulum. At this frame, they are not helping the jump at all. The hips are doing all the launching. But we'll be using the arms in the next keyframe as more momentum to help this character launch up. Okay, go 4 more frames ahead to frame 68. The character's leg power is still launching his hips up and forward. Most of the work is being done by the left leg. The right leg lifts off the ground, so it can't really help. Now the arms start to become a momentum factor. Their weight and speed start to help the character propel forward and upwards. Okay, offset the arms so you don't get twinning. So make sure you bend the clavicles to show the weight of the arms and also flexibility of the chest. Let's make this keyframe the last keyframe the character is on the ground, so let's extend his left leg out till it's almost straight. Key the right foot target for frame 64 before we move on to frame 68. At frame 68, move the target up. The right foot is now active and will not drag behind. It's part of the lifting process now. Now we're going to fix the toe, go back to frame 64, and key the toe to make sure it won't change. Now at frame 68, straighten out the toe. Notice the toe animates slowly and doesn't really push off the ground. We need to add another keyframe between 64 and 68 to animate the toe pushing off the ground. So at frame 66, push off the ground with those toes. Real-time playback. So far, so good. Okay, let's move ahead 4 frames to frame 72. Arc the spine to its most flexed position. This is when the spine is the strongest. Accentuate the strength by looking his head down. Raise the character in the air. Now he's airborne. The right leg is still lifting with the body. Adjust the knee position to make it look stronger. Okay, the arms are now at their apex and stops giving momentum for lifting up. So eventually the arms will slow down. Still keep the arms offset from each other though, so we don't get that twinning motion. Key the left foot target in frame 68 before moving it in frame 72. Now at frame 72, the left foot target drags behind. In the front view, let's bring the left foot more to the center so the body is more balanced. We may want to extend the left leg some more to show that they just pushed off the ground. Uh-oh, we have a foot error here. Looks like I didn't key the foot target for rotations in frame 68. I just keyed for translations. So I'll just manually fix it in frame 68. Now it looks like I have to flatten the curve out for the rotations. Let's do that in the graph editor. Select the whole range just to make sure and flatten out the curves. Now the left foot is fixed. Let's move on. Go 4 more frames ahead to frame 76. Since I want to start twisting the torso now, I'll make sure I keyed the hips for the twisting in frame 68. Now in frame 76, I'll start twisting. The purpose of twisting is to eventually get the right leg in position for a side kick. So I want the side of the character aiming forward. At this point, the spine stops flexing and the character uses his abs to pull his hips in. Bring his foot up with his torso. In martial arts, we call this chambering. Like when you put a bullet in a chamber of a gun, it's ready to fire. When you chamber a foot or a fist, it's ready to strike out. So when you chamber a foot, the knee must be up and in. Let's bring in the other leg so the character gets in a tight ball. Okay, that's the beginning of the chambering, or the anticipation of the side kick. Let's move on to complete the anticipation. So go 4 more frames up to frame 80. Remember to keep his body moving in the same trajectory. Let's twist his hips back more and sideways to really get the side aiming to where the character is going to kick. Now for the rest of the spine, let's curve it and make it into almost a ball. Tweak the arms. The arms are somewhat loose right now. They're not really doing much. Aim the head. The head should be looking at where it wants to kick. Keep the left arm loose but in. Bring in the left leg. Let's really chamber the right leg, have it ready to shoot out. The left leg is the counterbalance of the right leg. Since the right leg is being chambered, the left leg should also chamber. Likewise, the arms should counterbalance each other. Okay, scrub back. Looks like the right foot needs to be chambered some more. I don't get that feeling that it's going to shoot out. Let's pull it in tighter, closer to the body. Have the heel aim out again. Okay, let's scrub back. Let's tilt the body back a little more so it's not so straight up and down. And then real-time playback. It's still not that dynamic when going into the crunched up pose at the apex, the chambered pose. It's kind of slow. So let's crunch up his body even tighter so we get a more explosive kick afterwards. Now he's pretty tightly compact. Scrub through. Seems to pop at the end. Less adjusted so it's not so tilted back. And he seems to travel horizontally too far at the end. So let's bring him back just a tad. Let's rotate him back up so we can see his head and face. Okay, that seems to work fine. Let's go to the next keyframe. Let's try 6 frames ahead and hold this pose for a little bit. So at frame 86, the character will basically be floating in mid-air for the same pose. Let's scrub through. Well, I was wrong. It looks like it's being held a bit too long. So let's go to Dope Sheet and shift those last keyframes back by 2 frames. And we want that keyframe to happen at frame 84 instead of frame 86. Okay, now we have the problem of the character traveling too far now. So let's translate him back a little bit. Oops, looks like I set those keyframes at frame 86. So let's go into the Dope Sheet and delete those keys at frame 86. And at frame 84, let's translate him back. Okay, it looks good. Now let's set keys for the rest of the joints in the body to hold this pose. Guess what? I did it again. I set all the keys at frame 86 and not 84. So let's go back in our Dope Sheet and slide all those keys to frame 84. Scrubbing through here, you can see that the rotation of the hips and torso is kind of rough. Let's find out the problem by looking in the graph editor. Nothing really obvious sticking out here. Let's just try to fix it manually. So tweak the hip rotations just a bit. That seems to work. Okay, let's keep on moving forward. Go 4 frames ahead to set the next keyframe at frame 88. And here, the character finally kicks. So let's straighten out his spine, extend his kicking leg, kick with his heel, counterbalance with the left leg, bring his head and torso up slightly so he sees what he's kicking. Extend his arms for balance also. Counterbalance both arms. Okay, that's a cool martial art looking pose. Let's scrub through. It looks okay. It's not explosive enough for me though. So let's extend his body out even more. Let's make the pose more extreme. So flex the spine out more, straighten the head a bit. Scrub through. Something is still off. I think it's because he stops traveling horizontally when he kicks. So let's translate him horizontally some more. Scrub through. Okay, maybe don't translate him over too far. Let's bring him back a bit. Let's straighten out his right leg some more to make it more extreme. Okay, with the left leg, we have to be careful about pinching because his angle is too far for this particular setup to handle. So just be careful about that. Let's bring the torso back up, make the pose more aesthetically pleasing. Okay, real-time playback. Let's play with some arm posing to try to make it more extreme. Nah, the arm thing isn't working too well. It's drawing too much attention to it. So let's go back to what we had. There's some arm bumpiness going on. Let's try playing with the left arm. Okay, let's get rid of the bumpiness. Let's try deleting one of the keyframes during the transition to the kick. Keyframe 84 seems like a good candidate. So in the dope sheet, select all the keys at frame 84 and then delete them. Now let's shift all the keys from frame 88 back down to frame 84. So our moving hold in the air is a lot shorter. Okay, real-time playback. Yeah, that's much better. Action flows much smoother. We have to fix a similar problem we encountered earlier, which is to translate him back horizontally a bit since we deleted about 4 frames from his animation. Scrub through. Yeah, it's looking good. Real-time playback. Ta-da! And that's it. That's our first pass at this jump and kick animation. What do you guys think? Not too bad, eh? Okay, the next steps we're going to do is to analyze it. We're going to critique it. Then we're going to go back and fix the problems and then add little nuances to make him look more alive. Then we're going to polish him up and render him out. Okay, let's review our first pass at this animation. It's not a bad pass. Overall, the first drop has good speed, but the jump up and the kick are lacking in energy. They seem to be almost slow motion. Also, we need to put more oomph on the anticipation of the jump. We need to add some life in the squatting pose in the middle and add some head acting, maybe some hand acting. It needs more hand animation throughout the entire animation to show some emotion. And since this is somewhat the camera angle I'm looking for, we need to balance out the squat pose for this angle. And also, we need to smooth out some arm motions in the air. Okay, so those are all the notes, and let's go ahead and fix our animation. The first thing I want to do is speed up the last half of the animation. So in a dope sheet, I'm going to shift all the keys closer together by one frame. Okay, on playback, it already looks much better. There's more energy in the jump and in the kick now. Let's take a look at the anticipation for the jump. I'm focusing on his head right now. I'm just seeing where the keyframes are at. What I want to do with the head is to have it scoop up to help lift the rest of the body off the ground. Let's make sure the head and neck are keyed at frame 61 so it won't change. Okay, delete the keyframe at frame 53. So at frame 57, we're going to dip the head down so it starts the scooping action. And why not at frame 58? Well, I want the scooping action to be offset from the rest of the body. I'll delete the existing head keyframe at frame 58. Scrub through to see if the scoop is working. It doesn't have that much effect on the animation. Let's push it to scoop deeper, make it more noticeable. Scrubbing through again, I'm not getting the effect I want. I don't feel that the head is really helping to lift off. So let's play around a little bit with the timing for the head. Let's look in a dope sheet and experiment with the neck and the head keyframes. Let's slide them so the neck and head scoop later, and this effect will be more of a head drag rather than a lead in with the head. It's not bad, it might work. But this gives us a sense that the hips move first, then the chest, then the head. The arms seem to be moving at the same time, so let's offset them a bit for a more organic looking feel. Let's take the left arm and offset it by one frame. For the elbow, let's offset it by 2 frames. Offset the left hand by 2 frames. And let's not forget the clavicle, so offset that by 1 frame. If you look at the top of our dope sheet, you can see that there are pretty much keyframes on every frame now. Our keys are hard to look at now, and that's why offsetting any keyframes should come towards the end of your work on your animation. Let's bend the arm at frame 50 so it has more distance to travel when it goes back. Okay, I'm checking the position from different angles. Let's play back. It looks better. Now at frame 21, let's try to match the arm pose that's in frame 50. Give the hand some flair. Scrubbing through. Looks okay. I think the held position from frame 21 to 50 might be too long. So let's slide all the keys from frame 50 back 10 frames to shorten the hold. Okay, playback. Actually, that's a little too short. It doesn't give the character enough time to think. He's just merely going through his motions. I want him to think before he jumps, to give him a little life. So let's try sliding all the keys to frame 45 and see what that's like. Okay, playback. It seems more natural now. He has enough time to think of what he's going to do next. Now let's give him some body language. Let's do a little bit of acting through his hands. So close his hand and turn it into a fist. Make him look like he's ready for action. Let's bend his fist forward to make it look like he's really clenching his fist. Okay, he looks stronger here. You can almost tell what his facial expression should look like. Let's figure out the place for the next keyframe for his fingers. In a dope sheet, you can see that there are some existing keyframes here for the fingers. For now, let's just remember that they are there, and let's not do anything with them yet. At frame 55, I'm going to open up the fingers as part of his anticipation for stretching back before leaping. Okay, it looks okay. Now as the hands go through swinging like a pendulum, I want them to tighten into a fist to help his hands accelerate and swing up. A good place to have a fist would be frame 58. So in a dope sheet, let's slide the existing keyframe and move it to frame 58. Now let's make the keyframe into a fist. Scrub through, the action looks pretty good. Let's check out the later half of the jump. So let's check out where the other fingers keyframes are. It's at frame 62, and just keep that in mind for now. The last pose in the animation is the last thing we're going to remember, so let's make it look cool. I'm going to play around with the hands to see what looks good. Maybe give him a kung fu pose looking thing. In our camera, it doesn't look so cool, so let's angle it a little bit more. Okay, it looks better. Let's bend the fingers a bit, make it more asymmetrical. Rotate it a bit more. Okay, that looks good. Scrub through. It looks fine. Now let's look at the right hand. So it should definitely close into a fist somewhere in the squatting position. Let's keyframe the fingers at the same keyframe as the hand. So at frame 21, I'll close the fingers into a fist. Okay, let's make the fist look stronger and bend it in a little. So somewhere before the fist happens, the hand should be open before he lands. Let's make it at frame 14, so open up the fingers at frame 14. Now when we scrub through, it looks a lot cooler. The hand clenches into a tight fist. Skip to frame 45 and close the fingers into a fist also. Then his fist will be closed throughout the entire squatting position. I'm just checking in a dope sheet where the keys are for the right hand, just to make sure we don't have any unwanted keyframes in there. Okay, now on the anticipation for the jump, We want the right hand to act similar to the left hand, so we have to open up the fingers and make them more dynamic. Frame 53 is where we want the fingers to be open, but let's check in a dope sheet to make sure that there are no conflicting keyframes. So during the jump, the fingers need to be closed in a fist to help with momentum. I think a good spot would be frame 57. In the dope sheet, let's check for conflicting keyframes. We see one at frame 58, so drag those keys to frame 57. Now in that keyframe, we could close the fingers into a fist. It looks okay. So let's move on to later in the jump. Over here at frame 62, the fist should be closed. So let's check in the dope sheet for conflicting keyframes. And yes, there is already a keyframe here, so we'll just adjust that keyframe then. So close the fist. And it looks good. Now for the rest of the animation, the fist should remain closed. Let's just make sure the fingers are keyframed on the last keyframe. Let's put a tiny bit more animation in this right hand. So in between keyframes 62 and 71, let's open up the fingers a little bit. You probably won't even notice it too much. There's some odd motion going on with the right arm in this area. So let's delete the keyframe for the right arm at frame 68 and try to smooth it out. As we can see that when deleting that keyframe, we lose some of the power and energy in the kick animation. Let's bring his arm back a bit to show some anticipation for that arm. Let's smooth out the elbow joint too. It's still a little bumpy in the arm area. Let's just delete that keyframe. I'd rather have it smooth than bumpy. In the dope sheet, we could see that we don't have keyframes in this area for the right shoulder, and the right elbow has one keyframe at frame 68. So let's smooth out the left arm and delete the key for the left shoulder at 68. Okay, it looks smoother. Let's do the same for the left elbow. Delete the key at 68. Okay, now both arms look pretty smooth. Here's our animation so far. The left hand pose isn't really working in the end. It's making the rest of them look wussy. So let's turn that into a fist and make him look stronger. Just make sure there are no conflicting keyframes for the fingers in that time range. Let's turn that hand into a fist and bend his fist forward. Make sure his wrist isn't twisted too far. Okay, it looks good. Here's the animation again. The right hand seems to be moving in the squatting pose. Let's make sure the pose is the same from the beginning of the squat at frame 21 to the end of the squat at frame 45. So we're going to copy the keyframe at 21 and paste it into frame 45. Wiggle it a little to change the pose very slightly. Okay, it looks like the same keyframe. Of course, we get this arcing motion in between. That's okay. It'll make the motion look smooth. Playback. Okay. I'm looking at the head right now before the anticipation. Now this is really nitpicking, but let's offset it very slightly. Okay, playback. Not much different, but we'll leave it. Let's play with the left arm a little bit, since it's predominant on the screen. Since the left arm seems to swing back pretty quickly on the land, let's delete one of the keyframes here. Looks like frame 16 is a good one to delete. So let's delete the elbow keyframe here. On frame 21, I'll bring the hand back a little bit more. Then I want to hold this arm position for a while. So let's skip ahead some frames. Let's go to frame 26 and key the arm in the same position. Now during the hold, the arm will bend slowly forwards. Actually, the hold might be too abrupt for the elbow joint. Let's delete the key at frame 26. Okay, let's keep the arm still moving in the swing back some more. So frame 26 will be the end of the swing. Now I want the arm to be held in this position for a short time. So let's skip ahead to frame 32 and make that the end of the moving hold. Okay, scrub back. Looks kind of wacky. Let's go back to frame 32 and delete the keyframe for the elbow joint and rekey it slightly back. Right now I'm just trying to smooth it out. It's still a little too much motion. On frame 32, I'll bring the shoulder joint down a little to make it less extreme. It's better, but let's make the hold a little longer. So in a dope sheet, let's slide the keyframe at frame 32 over to frame 36. In real-time playback, the arm looks kind of awkward. I think I'm going to have to shorten the hold then, instead of lengthen it. Let's move these keys down to frame 31. Okay, I'm just tweaking the hand to give it a bit of flow. It still seems like a loose door swinging around, so I'm going to make the arm stick out more and hold that pose tighter so it's not so loose. We'll be looking at the frame range from 21 to 31. In the graph editor, let's take a look at the curves in that frame range. The red and blue curves are relatively flat, but the green curve has an arc on it, so let's flatten that out a bit. Okay, let's play that back. As you will notice, the upper arm doesn't move so much. It remains still while the elbow does the moving. I think I'll delete this moving hold. I know we may feel like we wasted our time trying to do it, but sometimes animation is a trial and error procedure. Sometimes you might not know what you like until you see it. So by deleting the keyframe at 31, the elbow bend from frame 26 to 45 is much slower and more subtle. The arm still looks like it's in the air too much, So at the end of the squatting pose, I want to drop the arm down a bit to show that he's at rest, especially since his arm is bending at that point. Okay, it looks a little less awkward, but the motion is still not quite right. It's too noticeable. You know, I'm a perfectionist, so I have to get this right, even if it kills me. In the graph editor, let's smooth out the key for frame 45. Now the upper arm hardly moves through the squatting pose. Yeah, it looks better. The arm is tighter. It looks like he's flexing his muscles more rather than letting his arm swing around. Okay, let's keep going with the muscle flexing idea and bring his arm in a little more at frame 45. I know I'm obsessing over this, but let's make the arm totally motionless. I'm going to like it. All right. Sometimes you have to say, it's not perfect, but it's done. And you got to know when to move on. Okay, let's put a little head acting in here. First, I'm going to make sure the head is keyed at frame 46, which is the end of the squat for the head and neck. So nudge these joints a bit. Now at frame 21, I want to rotate his head to the side a bit. I want him to look around first before he jumps to give him some life. Now let's hold this head position for a bit. So go to frame 30 and key the head for the same pose. Make sure the keys are relatively the same in the graph editor, so flatten out the curve. Go ahead 6 more frames and have him look forward to match the pose in frame 45. Okay, make sure the curves are somewhat flat in the graph editor so his head doesn't drift around. Let's play back. Okay, it looks cool, but the head animation right when he lands might be too fast. So in the graph editor, for frame 16, let's smooth out the curves a bit so the head action is not too sharp. Okay, that looks better. Let's make his left hand tighter on the swing back. Right now it's kind of loose, so let's make it into a fist. Frame 21 is a good place to make it a fist. Looking at the dope sheet, we can see that we have no keys for the left hand fingers at frame 21, so let's just turn it into a fist. But I do want some type of animation in the hand, so let's make his hand open before it turns into a fist. So say at frame 12, we open up his hand. Okay, the left hand looks smooth now. Let's put more action in the left hand. First, I want to make sure I still have a fist at frame 45, so key the fingers into a fist. Now let's go back to frame 26 and open up the fingers since the hand just swung back. Okay, let's angle the hand to give it an aerodynamic pose. Now I want to give more time between the fist at frame 21 and the open hand at frame 26. Let's delete the fist for now and just play around a bit. Now between keyframe 12 and 26, there's not much hand animation going on. So at frame 12, I want the fingers to be in a more neutral semi-closed hand. At frame 21, I want to smooth out the hand animation. Let's do that in the graph editor. Cool. We get some nice follow-through action here in the hand. Let's put even more follow-through in the fingers. We could do that easily by sliding the finger keyframes over a few frames. Let's say frame 31. It looked better before, but I like the speed in which it closes to a fist here. So select the fist keyframe in the dope sheet also. Okay, that's cool. The follow through is better, and we can see the fist for a longer period of time. He seems a little light in the squat pose, so let's sink him down a bit towards the end of the squat. Right now I'm just looking at the height of the hips throughout these keyframes. Let's delete the keyframe for the hips at frame 21. First, make sure frame 45 is keyed for the hips. Now delete frame 21. Now make sure it is only for the hip joint and not any other bones below the hierarchy. We don't want to lose anything else. Okay, the hip motion looks pretty smooth and pretty solid now. The last thing I want to do is make the kick more snappy. It still looks a little too slow for my taste. So we can easily do this by selecting all the keys at the end and shift back by one frame. I think one frame should do it. And yep, the kick is more powerful now. It's more of a popping motion. And there you have it. That was the second pass and the polishing pass of our animation. And now here's the final rendered animation. It has more life, it has more energy, more style than before, and it's all done. So that wasn't so bad, was it? Nah. Alright, I'll see you guys next time.